The morning her stepmother handed her the dress, Alara did not look down at it right away. She looked at Marin's face instead, and what she saw there was not anger or even indifference. It was something quieter and more deliberate than either of those things. It was satisfaction. The kind that had been a long time coming, stored carefully, brought out now at exactly the right moment like a weapon polished in secret. The kind of satisfaction that a person only feels when they have been planning something, and the plan has arrived at its intended destination without a single hitch. Alara stood in the doorway of Marin's room and held herself still and felt the weight of that look, and did not let it reach her face. The dress was folded over Marin's arm, brown fabric. Coarse, the kind used for cleaning rags or the working uniforms of house staff in households that did not spend much thought on their workers' appearance. The hem was uneven. One side hung lower than the other by almost 2 full inches. The sash at the waist was a muddy orange that belonged to no color family that Alara could name. Marin held it out with 2 fingers, the way one might hold something slightly distasteful, and said, in a voice arranged for reasonableness, that this was what Alara would wear to the Duke's ball. She said that it had been laundered. She said that it was perfectly adequate for the occasion. Alara looked at it for one moment, then she took it. She did not argue, she did not say a single word. She turned and walked down the corridor to the small room at the back of the house that had become her room after her father died, and she set the dress on the narrow bed, and she sat beside it on the edge of the mattress, and she looked at it and she thought. She had been thinking a great deal lately. It was the one thing Marin had not found a way to take from her. But the dress was not where this story began. The dress was simply where it became impossible to pretend any longer. To understand what that dress meant and what Alara did with it, you have to go further back. You have to go back to the house before Marin was in it, before the corridors smelled of Marin's particular perfume, and the accounts were kept in Marin's handwriting, before the sound of Irene and Celia on the upper landing had replaced the sound of Clara Voss singing badly and with great enthusiasm from the kitchen. You have to go back to the beginning of Alara, which is also the beginning of everything that mattered. Alara Voss had been born in a house full of warmth. This is not a figure of speech. It was a house that was genuinely warm, in the way that some houses are, not because of their architecture or their furnishings, but because of the people who lived inside them and the particular quality of attention those people gave to one another and to the life they were building together. Her father, George Voss, had built his business over 20 years of careful and consistent work. He traded fabric and dye across 3 counties and was known among the merchants he dealt with as someone whose word was reliable, whose accounts were accurate, and whose patience with a difficult negotiation was almost without limit. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make speeches or tell long stories or gesture widely with his hands when he talked. What he did was notice things. He noticed when Alara's shoes had become too tight before she thought to mention it. He noticed when the cook, a woman named Harriet who had worked for the family for 15 years, was having a difficult week, and he left extra coins on the kitchen table without making a production of it. He noticed the quality of light in the late afternoon, the particular shift that happened in autumn when the sun came through at a lower angle and turned everything a shade of gold that did not exist at any other time of year, and he would sometimes stand at the window in the front room just to watch it change, not doing anything else, simply being present for something beautiful that was only there for a few minutes. Alara had grown up watching her father do this, and she had learned, without being taught in any formal sense, that paying attention was its own kind of love, that to see something clearly and give it your full presence was a way of saying that it mattered. Her mother, Clara, had been a different kind of person in almost every respect, though she and George had fit together in the way of 2 things that are different enough to be complementary rather than competing. Where George was quiet and steady and moved through life at a deliberate pace, Clara was quick and warm and constantly in motion. She laughed easily and loudly, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere genuine and could not be mistaken for a performance. She burned things on the stove because she was always attempting to do 3 tasks at once, and one of them inevitably suffered for it. She sang while she worked, not particularly well, but with an enthusiasm that made the quality of the notes entirely beside the point. She had an opinion about nearly everything and shared those opinions freely, not to dominate conversation, but because she was genuinely interested in what other people thought, and sharing her own view seemed to her the most direct way of inviting a response. But the thing about Clara that shaped Alara most deeply was this: she was one of the finest needlewomen in the region, and she had never once called herself that. She called it simply knowing what fabric wants to do. She had learned from her own mother, who had learned from hers, and the knowledge had passed down through the hands rather than through any formal instruction or written guidance. What Clara meant by knowing what fabric wants was something specific and practical, and also something that resisted easy explanation to those who had not felt it themselves. It was the understanding that cloth had a nature, a grain, a direction in which it preferred to move and a direction in which it resisted being moved. A weight that determined how it would fall when released. A weave that decided which stitches would hold over years of wear and which would slowly give. Working with that nature rather than against it was the difference, Clara said, between a garment that looked right and one that merely looked expensive. She had begun teaching Alara before Alara was old enough to hold a needle without assistance. Not because she had decided to teach exactly, but because Alara was always there, always watching, and asking the questions that made Clara explain out loud the things she usually did entirely by instinct. By the time Alara was 9, she could feel the grain of fabric accurately with her fingers before she ever cut into it. By 12, she could construct a simple garment from scratch without a pattern, working from a mental image that her hands translated directly into cloth without the intermediate step of drawing or planning on paper. By 15, her stitching was finer than her mother's, more consistent and more precise, though she never said so and Clara never said it either. It was simply true, and they both knew it, and that understanding between them was its own kind of conversation. The house was full of the things that hands make when they know what they are doing, not only sewn things but all kinds of things. George had a craftsman's deep appreciation for well-made objects, and the house was furnished with pieces chosen for quality and use rather than for display alone. Nothing in it was purely ornamental. Everything served a purpose and served it well. Alara grew up understanding, in the way you understand things that are shown to you rather than stated, that the made world had standards, and that meeting those standards was not a matter of wealth but of attention and care. Clara died in the spring of Alara's 16th year, a fever that came suddenly and moved fast and did not give anyone the time that preparation requires. One week she was burning soup and singing from the kitchen and laughing at something George said across the dinner table. The next she was gone. The house was very quiet after that in a way that was not the quietness of a quiet house, but the quietness of something missing that had been there before. An absence with a shape so specific that you kept turning toward it by habit and finding only air. George went through his days without complaint. Alara watched him carefully in those first weeks and saw the effort it cost him, the way he had to reconstruct each ordinary action from its component pieces because the habit that had made it automatic was built entirely around Clara, and without her the habit had no foundation to stand on. He ate less. He slept poorly. He stood at the window in the late afternoon as he always had, but now when he turned away from it, his face was empty in a way it had never been before. The light was the same light it had always been. He was the one that had changed. Alara was 16, and she stepped into everything that needed doing. Not because anyone had told her to, but because she looked at the household and saw what was required, and she was the one who was present. She cooked badly at first, with the kind of persistent failure that meant she was paying close attention and learning from every mistake. She kept the household accounts in the ledger her father had always maintained, sitting at his desk in the evenings with the lamp turned up, working through the numbers until they were clean and settled. She managed the correspondence and the deliveries and the supplier relationships, writing letters in her clear, direct handwriting and keeping precise track of what was owed and what was owing. She was 17 years old and she carried all of it without being asked, because there was no one else, and because she was her mother's daughter and her father's, and both of them had taught her, without using the word, that you did what was needed because it needed doing. She did not tell her father how much she was managing. She did not want him to feel it as a weight added to the weight he was already carrying. She simply did it and showed him on the evenings when he was more present and more himself that the household was in order and the accounts were balanced and there was nothing pressing that required his attention. She could see the gratitude in him when he understood this, and the slight guilt that came with the gratitude and the relief that was larger than both. She held those things and let them be what they were, and did not ask for anything in return. It was in the second year after her mother's death that George Voss met Countess Maren Aldrich. Maren had been a widow herself for 4 years at that point. She had been married to a minor count whose title had considerably more weight than his finances by the time he died, leaving her with 2 daughters, a respected surname, a house in town that cost more to maintain than her income comfortably allowed, and a very precise understanding of what she needed and where it might be found. She was not, to be fair about it, a woman without genuine qualities. She was organized and precise and efficient in everything she undertook. She managed her own affairs with an intelligence that was real rather than performed. She dressed with care and taste. She had excellent manners, the kind that are second nature rather than consciously applied, and she knew how to listen when listening was useful. She was also, and this was the part that mattered most, very skilled at making a lonely man feel seen. George was lonely. This is the simplest true thing that can be said about him at that period of his life, and it explains more than any more complex analysis would. He had been a man built for partnership. The life he had constructed with Clara had been built around two people thinking together and moving through the world together, and the 3 years since her death had been the experience of half a structure trying to hold its own shape. When Maren came into his life through a mutual acquaintance at a business gathering he had attended more from habit than desire, she brought with her the thing he had been most lacking, which was the sense of being accompanied. Alara saw all of this clearly. She was not a stupid girl, and she had been paying attention to people since she was old enough to understand that attention was something you could give or withhold. She watched Maren with her father, and she tried genuinely to see what was real in what she observed, because she knew that her own grief and her own protectiveness of her father might make her see threat where there was none. She found some real things. Maren did bring her father comfort in ways that were visible and specific. Maren was organized and capable, and did not cause obvious friction in the household. She was not actively unkind to George in any way that Alara could observe directly. But there were other things, smaller and harder to name but no less real for that. The way Maren's eyes moved through any room she entered for the first time, not taking in the aesthetic but cataloging the contents with the eye of someone doing an inventory. The way she spoke about money with the fluency of someone for whom it was a constant and primary consideration. The way she behaved with the household staff in moments when she believed no one of consequence was watching, a coolness that was not in the warmth she showed in the sitting room with George. And above all, the way she looked at Alara, not with warmth, not with hostility, with assessment. The careful measuring look of someone determining what category a thing belongs to and what that means for their arrangements. Alara said nothing of any of this to her father. She thought about it. She came close several times. Each time she thought it through to its conclusion, and the conclusion was the same. She had feelings and observations and instincts, but no facts that would stand against the clear and specific fact that her father was lighter than she had seen him in 3 years. Impressions delivered to a man who had been given back the sense of being accompanied would not be heard as concern. They would be heard as interference. So she stayed silent and watchful, and moved through the changed household with the quiet efficiency that had become her natural manner. They married quietly at the end of that year, a small ceremony and a dinner after at the house. George smiled on the day in a way he had not smiled in all the time since Clara died, and when he held Maren's hand at the table after the ceremony there was ease in him that Alara had been missing on his behalf. She sat across the table from them and she made herself be glad for him. She wanted very much to be glad. She came close to entirely managing it. Maren's daughters came with her. Irene, a year older than Alara, and Celia, a year younger. They were not cruel girls in any considered or deliberate way. They were simply people who had grown up in the center of their own world and had not been required to develop much awareness of anything that did not bear directly on their own comfort and wishes. They moved through the house as though it had always been theirs, and the question of where Alara fit into the new arrangement was one they had not asked and did not appear to find pressing. They used her things without asking because the idea of asking did not occur to them. They spoke across her at meals because she was not a person whose contribution to the conversation they had reason to seek out. Rooms were rearranged after a series of complaints about size and placement, and Alara moved to a smaller room at the back without being told directly. It was simply presented as a settled matter, as though the decision had emerged from the nature of things rather than from anyone's deliberate choice. This was the method. Not dramatic confrontation, but the slow accumulation of small arrangements, each one too minor to resist without seeming unreasonable, all of them together adding up to a complete transformation of Alara's position in the household. From the daughter of the house to its periphery, not through force but through the patient application of social weight, pressing her gradually toward the edges until the edges felt like where she had always been. Her father did not see it. or he saw something less than the whole of it and chose to trust Marin's management of things that had previously been his to manage. Alara believed he loved her. She had never doubted this. But grief had softened the precision of his attention, and Marin had stepped smoothly into the space that softness created, and the energy he had once directed at noticing things had been redirected into the simpler work of maintaining a life that finally felt possible again. He was present with Alara. He asked about her days, but he was not looking at the household the way he used to look at the late afternoon light, with the focused attention of someone who truly intended to see. He was looking at it through the arrangement Marin had made, and that arrangement had not been designed with his daughter's well-being as its first concern. George fell ill in the autumn of the following year. It was not a dramatic illness with a clear beginning. It was more like a long diminishment, a gradual stepping back from the world, so gradual that it could have been mistaken for ordinary tiredness until it was too late to mistake it for anything. Alara understood what was happening before anyone said anything. There are things the body knows before the mind has finished reasoning them through, and she knew this the way she knew when a seam was wrong before she could identify the specific stitch that had caused the problem. She sat with him in his room in the evenings and read to him when he asked and held his hand when he reached for hers. She let him talk about her mother without steering him away from it. He told her once, near the very end, that she had her mother's hands. She held that sentence carefully, the way you hold something small and irreplaceable, and she carried it with her after he was gone. He died in winter in his chair by the fire on a quiet evening when the house was still. It was peaceful, people said afterward, and this was true. It did not make it easier, but it made it something other than the worst kind of thing. And then the house that had been her parents' house was a house full of strangers, and what happened next happened through documents. Marin had been attentive during the months of George's illness in ways that went beyond emotional support. She had arranged for a solicitor to visit twice, on days when George was weak enough that the careful reading of documents required more concentration than he had easily available. The arrangements that resulted from those visits placed the management of the estate and the household accounts in Marin's hands as the surviving spouse, under conditions described in legal language that required some translation before Alara fully understood what they meant. Marin translated them for her, in the small sitting room 2 weeks after the funeral, in a tone that was composed and almost kind. She said Alara was welcome here. She said the household would continue as before. She said she hoped Alara understood. Alara sat across from her and listened, and kept her face still and understood everything. She was 18 years old, and the house she had been born in was no longer hers in any legal sense, and the woman across from her with the folded hands had been careful and patient and thorough, and this was where all of that care and patience and thoroughness had been pointed. She stood, thanked Marin for her clarity, and went upstairs. She did not cry. She sat on the narrow bed in the small room that was now simply her room rather than one of many rooms in her own house, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought for a long time. She thought about what remained. She thought about what she knew and what she had not yet said to anyone. She thought about the solicitor in the next county and the visit she had made there 6 months after her father's death, the figures she had been shown in that small quiet office, the terms she had been given time to read and reread and understand. She had said nothing about it to Marin. She had said nothing about it to anyone. She had gone back to the house that day and continued exactly as before, and she had waited for the moment that would make speaking useful. She reached under the bed and touched the bolt of ivory cloth with her fingertips without pulling it out. Still there, still uncut, waiting in the particular patient way of things that do not know they are waiting. She was 18 years old, and she was still entirely herself. That, in the end, was what Marin had not managed. The months that followed George Voss's death were an education in a kind of endurance that no one teaches formally, because no one wants to admit it needs learning. Alara moved through the household with the quiet efficiency she had developed over years of managing things that were not technically hers to manage, and she brought to her new situation the same quality of attention she brought to everything, which was the attention of someone who intended to understand what they were in before they decided what to do about it. The household under Marin's management was not dramatically different in its surface from the household George had run. The meals came at the same hours, the accounts were kept with precision, the house was maintained. Harriet remained in the kitchen and Dot remained as the housemaid, and the other regular arrangements continued as before. Marin was not the kind of woman who created chaos. She was the kind of woman who created order according to her own design, And in the months after the funeral, she did this thoroughly and without hurry. The differences were in the details. They were always in the details. Ilara's room was the small one at the back of the house. This had been established before George died and simply continued after, so there was no moment of reassignment to point to. She had fewer candles allotted to her room than any other. She understood this not as a policy, but as the natural outcome of a household where resources were distributed according to position, and her position had been decided. She ate at the table with the family because Maren maintained the form of a unified household, but she ate at the end of the table, in the chair that had been Irene's before Irene moved to the chair that had been Ilara's mother's. This had happened so gradually that Ilara had moved before noticing she was moving, which was the particular achievement of the method. She was not given pocket money. She had not been given pocket money by her father either, but she had had access to the household accounts and had taken from them what she needed for her own minor expenses, simply noting them in the ledger as she did every other transaction. This access no longer existed. If she needed something, she was to ask Maren, who would consider the request and respond appropriately. This was how Maren phrased it. The phrase appropriately was the part that mattered. It meant according to Maren's judgment, not according to any standard Ilara could predict or rely on. She did not ask for much. She had learned early, from watching both her parents, the difference between wanting something and needing it, and she applied this distinction more stringently now than she had before because she understood that each request gave Maren an opportunity to exercise the power she had been given. Ilara minimized the opportunities. This was not strategy exactly. It was more like the instinct of someone who understands the terrain they are moving through and adjusts their footstep accordingly. What she did not minimize was her own work. She continued to sew in the evenings in the small room by whatever light was available. She had her materials, the box of fabric pieces and thread and needles and pins that she had kept through all the changes, and she worked through the evenings with the steadiness that work gave her. It was not merely occupying the time. The work was its own world, fully engaging, requiring everything she had to give it when she was giving it all she had. In the small room in the evenings with the needle in her hand, she was not the displaced daughter of the household, or the occupant of the back room, or the person whose meals came at the end of the table. She was simply someone who knew what she was doing, and the cloth under her hands responded to what she knew. This was the thing Maren had not thought to account for, and perhaps could not have accounted for even if she had thought to, because it required understanding what the work was and what it did. Maren understood the commercial value of skilled needlework. She did not understand the other value, which was harder to quantify and therefore invisible to a particular kind of thinking. The work kept Ilara whole in the way that nothing else could have, at a time when the alternative to being whole was being less than herself, and she had decided, without using the word, that she would not be less than herself. She would be in diminished circumstances, but she would be entirely in them. Irene and Celia occupied the household in the manner of people who have moved into someone else's space and made it their own so completely that they no longer experience it as having belonged to anyone before them. They were not imaginative about this. It was not that they had considered the question of Ilara's prior claim and dismissed it. They simply did not experience the question as existing. This made them easier to live with than they would have been had they been actively thinking about it, because their indifference was genuine rather than performed, and genuine indifference is at least consistent and therefore predictable. Irene had a quality that Ilara watched with interest and some respect, which was the capacity to move through any social situation with complete composure. She never appeared uncertain or caught off guard. She responded to everything with the smooth competence of someone who had been trained for exactly this, which she had been, because Maren was a thorough teacher of the things she considered essential. Irene would make someone an excellent wife in precisely the sense that such wives were required in households like this one. She would manage social obligations with precision. She would maintain the right relationships with the right people. She would be appropriate in all the ways that appropriateness was measured. Celia was younger and less finished in her composure. She showed things occasionally, sometimes annoyance and sometimes something that was almost warmth before she remembered herself. Ilara found this more interesting than Irene's completeness. There was something in Celia that had not yet been entirely organized into its expected shape, and Ilara sometimes wondered, in the detached way she wondered about things she could not influence, what shape it might eventually take if it had been left to find its own. Maren managed her daughters with the same efficient precision she brought to the household accounts. She was not an affectionate mother in any demonstrative way. She did not use words of warmth. What she gave them was preparation, the specific and thorough preparation of girls who were going to have to make good marriages because there was not another reliable option, and making a good marriage required certain things that Maren was in a position to provide. She provided them without sentimentality, and her daughters received them without complaint, because they understood, at whatever level they understood such things, that this was the work they had been born into. Alara watched all of this from the position she occupied, which was inside the household but not of it in any of the ways that actually mattered, and she thought about it in the evenings when she was working. She thought about what she had and what she did not have, and she tried to be accurate about both rather than letting frustration make her inventory either larger or smaller than it was. She had her hands and her knowledge and the small box of materials. She had Harriet, who had known her since she was small and who had the kind of loyalty that precedes any deliberate decision to be loyal, the loyalty that comes from simply having been there for a long time and having cared for the person the whole of that time. She had Dot, who was not subtle but was reliably present and reliably on the correct side of her sympathies. She had the small box under the bed that contained the things she was keeping, including a bolt of ivory cloth that she had purchased with her own coins years before and had never cut. She had the information from the solicitor in the next county. This was the most important thing she had, and the one she was most careful about. She had gone to see him 6 months after her father's funeral, on a morning when Maren had sent her into town for household errands that would plausibly account for the morning's absence. The solicitor's office was a small room above a stationer's shop, furnished with the particular clutter of a man who worked with many pieces of paper and had developed a system for managing them that no one else could navigate. His name was Peter Fowler, and he was past 60, and had the manner of someone who had seen most of the ways that legal arrangements could go wrong, and had strong feelings about the ones that were entirely avoidable. He had written to her a month after the funeral to say that there were matters relating to her late father's estate that she should be made aware of, and that he would be glad to explain them to her at her convenience. The letter had been brief and formal and had not been intercepted, either because Maren did not know to look for it, or because the habit of intercepting correspondence was one she had not yet established. Alara had read it in the privacy of her room and had held it for a day before responding, and had arranged the visit for a morning when the household would not note her absence. The solicitor had shown her, over the course of an hour in his cluttered office with a cup of tea she had barely touched, the documents relating to a trust that her father had established at her birth. It was not large. It was not the kind of trust that changed the fundamental picture of a person's circumstances at a stroke. But it was real, and it was in her name, and it had been properly established and properly maintained through a firm that had no connection to Maren or to the solicitor who had managed the arrangements after George's death. Its existence had not been mentioned in any of the documents Maren had presented to Alara in the small sitting room 2 weeks after the funeral. Alara had asked Fowler whether this was an oversight or a decision. Fowler had looked at her over his papers with the expression of a man who respected directness and was going to offer it in return, and had said that in his professional experience, things of this nature were rarely oversights. She had asked what she could do about it. He had said that she could, at any time she chose, access the trust through the proper channels. He had also said more carefully that the trust's existence raised questions about certain other arrangements that had been made in the period of her father's illness, questions that a solicitor of her choosing with appropriate standing might find it productive to examine. She had thanked him and gone back to the household and told no one. She had thought in the months since about when the right moment would be. She had thought about what right meant in that sentence, not just strategically but actually right, a moment when the action would accomplish what it needed to accomplish without creating more difficulty than it resolved. She had a clear understanding that moving too early, without adequate standing or resources to sustain what she started, was worse than not moving at all. She had a clear understanding that the right moment required not just the right information but the right conditions around the information. She had been patient. Patience was not her natural inclination. She was, like her mother, a person who preferred to act when action was available. But she had learned, in the years since her mother's death and the years since her father's, a patience that was not passivity but something more specific, the patience of someone who has chosen to wait because waiting serves the outcome better than acting before the conditions are right. It was the patience she used when she was deciding where to make a cut in a difficult piece of cloth, You looked at the grain and you felt the weight and you held the scissors until you knew. Then you cut without flinching. She was holding the scissors. The autumn that brought the Duke's invitation was the third autumn since her father's death. 3 years was long enough that certain things had settled into the shape of permanence, the things that were going to be permanent, and Alara had an increasingly clear sense of what those things were and what they were not. The household had its order and its patterns. Marin's daughters had grown into the positions Marin had been preparing them for. Irene was being considered for a match that Marin was pursuing with the strategic precision she brought to everything. Celia was beginning to be taken to social occasions where the relevant introductions could be made. The household's social calendar was Marin's calendar, organized according to Marin's priorities, and Alara was not on it in any role except as an incidental background presence. This had been acceptable because it had been temporary. She had always known it was temporary, not because she was naive about her situation, but because she was not naive about her own resources and her own capacity to use them, and she had understood from the first evening in the solicitor's office that the temporary nature of the situation was something she was choosing. She could have moved sooner. She had chosen not to. She had been waiting for the conditions that would make the action effective rather than merely possible. She was beginning to think the conditions might be arriving. The invitation to the Duke's ball came on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. She knew about it because Dot told her that evening in the kitchen with the carefully not knowing expression she always wore when she was telling Alara something she probably should not know. Marin had received it. Marin had discussed it with Irene in the sitting room with the door not entirely closed. There was going to be attendance. Alara's name had come up in a tone that did not suggest inclusion. Alara listened, she thanked Dot, she went upstairs and thought about it for an hour. Then she knocked on Marin's door. This was not something she often did. The knock was direct enough that, when Marin opened the door, her expression showed a brief genuine surprise before it was composed again. Alara stood in the doorway and said, without preamble and without apology, that she would like to attend the ball if that was possible. Marin looked at her for a moment. The calculation in her eyes was visible if you knew what to look for, which Alara did. It was the calculation of someone working out whether allowing this served their purposes or undermined them, and the working out was happening quickly and with the fluency of a person who was very good at this particular kind of calculation. Then Marin said yes. She said it simply with a small and contained smile. Alara thanked her and went back to her room and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about that smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed something they intended to use. Marin had agreed not because it was generous or because she felt anything warm toward Alara, but because there was a way to use Alara's attendance that served Marin's purposes better than her absence would. Alara did not know yet what that way was. She waited to find out. She found out 3 days before the ball, when Marin came to her door with the brown dress over her arm. The dress was coarser up close than it had appeared at a distance. The weave was loose and uneven, the kind of fabric that was produced cheaply and in large quantities for industrial purposes rather than for wear. The cut was wrong in multiple specific ways that Alara could identify immediately from looking at it. Too wide in the shoulder, too narrow in the sleeve, with the kind of proportional error that came not from inexperience but from indifference. The hem was uneven by nearly 2 inches between the left and right sides. The sash was a color that fought with everything around it and won nothing from the conflict. Marin set it on the bed with the composed satisfaction of someone whose plan had arrived at its intended point. She said again that it had been laundered. She said it would do perfectly well for the occasion. She said it in the tone that expected no argument because it had arranged things so that argument would be both unreasonable and useless. Alara looked at the dress on the bed. She looked at it for a full minute. Then she looked at the place under the bed where the ivory cloth waited in its bolt. She said very politely that she appreciated Marin's thoughtfulness. Marin left, and Alara sat beside the dress on the bed, and she reached under the bed and pulled out the bolt of ivory cloth, and she held it in her hands, and she felt the grain of it and tested the drape of it, and thought about what 2 days and steady hands and the knowledge her mother had given her could accomplish. And something settled in her that had been unsettled for 3 years. Not joy exactly, and not anger either, though both of those things were somewhere in it. Something more like clarity. The particular clarity of a person who has been waiting for the right moment and has just understood that the right moment has arrived. She put the brown dress aside. She set the ivory cloth on the table. She picked up her scissors. And she began. The first cut was always the hardest, not because it required more technical skill than anything that came before or after, but because of what it committed you to. Once the scissors moved through cloth, the cloth became something other than what it had been. You could not go back, you could not unchoose the line you had made. Alara had understood this since childhood, sitting at her mother's side, watching Clara draw blade through fabric with a steadiness that had seemed, to a young child, almost careless. She had asked once how her mother did it, how she moved through that irreversible moment without flinching. Clara had looked up from the cloth and said that the flinch came from not yet trusting what you already knew. When you knew the cloth and you knew your own hands and you had thought clearly about what you were making, there was nothing left in the question that was uncertain. The cut was simply the beginning. The fear was a sign that you had not finished thinking, not a sign that thinking was impossible. Alara had finished thinking. She made the first cut without flinching, and the ivory cloth parted cleanly along the line she had drawn in her mind before she touched the scissors, and she was committed, and the commitment felt exactly like the right thing. She had spent the first part of the evening before the cutting doing what she always did before any serious work. She did not touch the scissors, and she did not touch the cloth until she had listened to it. She laid the bolt out across the table and ran her palms over the surface slowly, feeling the grain in the way that her mother had taught her to feel it, the direction of the weave, the response of the fabric to pressure, the particular way it stiffened when you moved against the grain and released when you moved with it. She lifted a length of it and held it over her hand and watched how it fell, how much it moved, how it behaved in the simple fact of gravity. It fell beautifully. It had a weight to it that most cloth of its fineness did not have, a substance that would allow it to fall straight and clean without collapsing or floating, the way cloth with too little body did in garments that never quite hung right no matter how well they were cut. She had bought this cloth years ago, with coins saved slowly over many months. She had been perhaps 14 at the time, in town with her mother for an errand that had brought them past a fabric merchant's shop, and she had seen the cloth in the window and had felt something that she could not have named at that age, but that she recognized now as the particular pull of a material that was exactly right for something you had not yet decided to make. Her mother had let her go in and hold it, because Clara always let her go in and hold things, because you could not know cloth without touching it, and touching cloth was always allowed in a good merchant's shop. Alara had held it and felt the weight of it and the drape of it and the quality of the weave, and she had saved for 4 more months and gone back and bought it, and she had kept it under the bed ever since. She had known, in the way she had always known certain things before she could explain them, that this cloth was waiting for something specific, that cutting it for anything less than what it was actually for would be a waste. She had come close twice. Once when she needed fabric for a winter garment and had almost convinced herself the ivory would do. Once when she had thought briefly of selling it in a difficult week after her father's death when money had been particularly scarce. Both times she had put it back. She had not known what she was waiting for. Now she knew, and the knowledge was completely clear. She thought about the shape of what she was making while her hands worked. She had not sketched it out, she never did. The image she carried was in her hands rather than on paper, built from years of making and unmaking things until the hands knew the geometry of cloth without needing to be shown it in advance. What she was making was simple in the way that honest things are simple, not simple because it required little skill, but simple because it needed nothing extra. A clean shoulder. A fitted bodice that followed the body's own line, sleeves close and long, a skirt that fell from the waist in a full and unencumbered sweep. No internal architecture, no boning or scaffolding, nothing artificial between the cloth and the person wearing it. The dress would be what the cloth was, and the cloth would be what it had always been, which was something very good. She cut the pattern pieces one by one, checking the grain alignment on each one before she set the scissors to it. This was the kind of care that was invisible in the finished garment and essential to it. A piece cut even slightly off grain would pull and distort under wear, eventually showing the error in the seam or the hem or the way the cloth moved. Alara had made this mistake once at 12, on a small garment that had seemed fine until she wore it and felt the way it tried to go somewhere other than where she did. She had never made the mistake again. The pieces took 2 hours to cut. She set them out on the bed in the order she would assemble them, front bodice and back bodice and sleeves and skirt panels, and the collar pieces that she had cut slightly larger than she would need so that she had room in the final edge for the work she intended to do on it. Then she picked up the brown dress. She looked at it for a moment with the attention she gave to materials she was going to work with. Not sentiment, not disgust, not the complicated feeling that she had every right to have about the way it had been given to her. Just attention. She turned it over and felt the fabric and assessed it. The weave was coarse. The cut was bad, but the weight was real. There was substance in it despite everything, the honest weight of cloth that was made to endure hard use and had the fiber content to do it. She found her seam ripper, the small tool with the hook-shaped blade that could open a seam without damaging the cloth on either side, and she went to work. She unpicked every seam in the brown dress. She did it slowly, taking care not to tear the cloth as she went, because she was not working carelessly and she never worked carelessly. As each seam opened, she laid the piece flat on the floor, smoothing it with her hands, checking whether the fabric had been damaged by the poor construction or whether it had survived it. It had mostly survived. It was good cloth in the sense that its quality was appropriate to its purpose, and its purpose was endurance. She laid the pieces out and looked at them and thought about lining. A lining was the invisible part of a garment, the part that most people never saw and many people never thought about. It was the part that determined whether a dress held its shape through a long evening of wearing, whether the outer cloth was protected from the friction of movement, whether the whole thing maintained its integrity under the pressures that a finished garment was subjected to in actual use. A good lining was the foundation of a good garment. A poor lining was why good cloth eventually failed. Ilara had been taught this by her mother with the same seriousness her mother had brought to all the teaching, because it was true, and because it was the kind of truth that only revealed itself over time, in the wearing rather than in the making. The brown cloth would make an excellent lining. This was not irony, it was simply accurate. It was stable and heavy, and had the quality of holding its shape without stretching, which was exactly what a lining needed to do. Inside the ivory cloth, it would be invisible. It would do nothing but hold the dress in its correct form across an entire evening of wearing. It would be the reason the outer cloth fell as beautifully at the end of the night as it had at the beginning. Maren had handed Ilara the lining for her own dress, which was a particular kind of irony, the kind that does not need to be pointed out because the fact of it is sufficient. Ilara began to sew. She worked with a single needle and thread, no mechanical assistance, because she had no other option, and because the work done this way had a quality the other method could not replicate in cloth of this fineness. The stitches she made were small and even and pulled to the exact tension that was needed, not a fraction too tight and not loose enough to leave movement in them. She could feel this in her fingers. She had been able to feel it since she was 10 years old, and she had trusted this feeling ever since, because the feeling was never wrong when she gave it her full attention. The bodice came together first, which was always where she began with a fitted garment, because the bodice determined everything else. The fit at the shoulder, the line at the waist, the relationship between the front and the back panels, all of these had to be right before the skirt could be attached, because a skirt attached to a wrong bodice would be wrong in ways that could not be corrected afterward. She worked each seam twice, first a construction seam and then finishing the edges, because she was not going to leave anything unfinished. Not in this. Not in the one thing she was making specifically to be seen. The shoulder seam was the one she gave the most care to. She had identified early in her practice that the shoulder seam was where most garments either achieved or failed their purpose. The angle of it, the slight curve, the way the sleeve cap would eventually set into it, all of this came down to whether the shoulder seam was exactly where it needed to be and held there with complete security. She set it 3 times before she was satisfied. The first time was close but not quite. The second time she found a small problem with the grain alignment and corrected it. The third time was right. She knew it was right because her hands told her before she held it up to check. By the time the household sounds had shifted to the quietness of late evening, which in this house meant Maren's light under the door had gone dark, and the creak of settling floorboards had stopped, and the night had become itself, Ilara had the bodice done and set aside, and the first skirt panel seamed and pinned to the second. She stretched her hands, feeling the specific tiredness of fine work in her fingers and across the back of her hand, and she looked at what she had made so far, and she let herself feel the satisfaction of it without apology. It was good. She went to sleep with the light still on. The next morning she was up before Harriet, which was early, Harriet being a woman who believed that the kitchen fire should be lit before the cold of the night had entirely released its hold on the stones. Ilara dressed quickly and went back to the table and picked up where she had stopped. She worked through the morning with the household moving around her in its normal patterns, the sound of it present but distant in the way it always was when she was deep in work. Celia's voice, the front door. Harriet in the kitchen, Marin's step in the corridor. She noted these things the way a person notes the weather, as background, present, and irrelevant to the task. The skirt came together through the morning. 4 panels, each one joined to the next with the same precision she had brought to the bodice, the grain carefully maintained throughout so that the whole thing would fall correctly rather than pulling in any direction. She attached the skirt to the bodice before noon and stood the assembled dress on the improvised form, the chair with the stuffed cloth over it, and stepped back and looked. The line was right, the shoulder sat correctly, the waist seam fell where it was supposed to fall. The skirt hanging from the form had the fall she had intended, straight and full and exactly itself. She looked at it for a long time. Then she sat back down and picked up the sleeves. The sleeves were the part that most tailors and dressmakers found most difficult, and that Alara had found most satisfying since the age when she had first understood what made them hard. A sleeve that was set incorrectly showed its error every time the arm moved. It pulled at the shoulder. It twisted at the elbow. It communicated, silently but constantly, that someone had not understood the geometry of the human arm and the geometry of the cloth that was meant to cover it. A sleeve set correctly was invisible. It was simply part of the garment, moving as the arm moved, never fighting the body and never forcing the body to accommodate it. She set the sleeves with the care they required. She pinned and checked and adjusted and pinned again, twice on each side, before she committed any of it to thread. When she was done, she moved the form, pulling one arm up and then the other, watching the sleeve respond, checking for any point of resistance or distortion. There was none. She let herself feel this as a small, complete victory. By mid-afternoon, the dress was assembled, and she had the seams finished, and the hem turned up and pressed into place with the iron she had heated over the small fire, working methodically around the full circumference of the skirt until every inch of it was lying exactly as it should. She hung the dress from the hook on the back of the door and looked at it in the afternoon light that came through the small window. Then she sat down with the collar pieces and the thread she had gathered from the old curtains, and she thought about what she was going to put on them. The embroidery was the part that came last, and that changed everything. A garment without embellishment was good or not depending entirely on its construction. Embellishment was the next question after construction, and the answer to it depended on understanding what the garment was and what the embellishment was for. Alara had seen gowns covered in embroidery that announced themselves like someone shouting in a quiet room. She had seen gowns with no embellishment at all that were elegant precisely because they needed nothing added. What she was making was neither of those things. It was a garment that was honest about what it was and had room for one thing more, something that would not shout but that would reward the person who looked closely. Hidden work, her mother had called it. She threaded the needle with the fine cream thread and let her hands begin to tell her what they knew. The pattern came from somewhere she could not name and did not try to. It was not copied from anything she had seen, and it was not planned in advance. It came from the hands moving, the way that things come from a long enough practice, from the place where the practice has become the body rather than something the body does separately. It was a border of small interlocking shapes that were not quite flowers and not quite anything geometric, something between those two families of form that felt organic, grown rather than constructed. She worked outward from the center of the collar in both directions, maintaining the symmetry by feel rather than by measurement, checking periodically by laying the two sides together and verifying that what she saw was what she intended. The work was slow. She wanted it to be slow. She wanted each stitch to be exactly what it needed to be, no more and no less, placed with the accuracy she brought to everything she considered worth doing well. She worked until the light through the window had shifted from afternoon to the particular quality of approaching evening, and then she lit her candle and kept working, because the work was not finished and there was still time, and she was not going to stop before the time ran out. By the time she set the needle down, the collar was done. She held it up and turned it in the candlelight, looking at what her hands had made, checking the consistency of the stitches and the evenness of the pattern and the weight of the thread against the cloth. Everything was as she had wanted it. Not perfect in the sense that she could always find something to adjust if she looked long enough, but right. Finished in the way that things are finished when the making is done and the thing is what it is. She attached the collar to the bodice. She sat with the cuffs and worked the same pattern on them, which went faster because the hands had now been doing this specific thing for several hours and had found the rhythm of it more completely. The right cuff took 2 hours. The left cuff took slightly longer because she was tired and had to work more slowly than her tiredness wanted to, because she had learned long ago that tiredness made shortcuts seem reasonable and shortcuts were never actually reasonable in work you intended to stand behind. She finished the left cuff with the candle half burned down, and her back aching in the specific way it ached after a long day of close work. She set the cuff down and pressed it with the iron and attached it to the sleeve with the even stitches she had maintained all day. Then she stood up and took the dress from the form and held it against herself and looked at what she could see in the small glass. What she saw was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. The candlelight caught the embroidery at the collar and turned the cream thread warm against the ivory cloth, and the effect was exactly what she had worked toward, the decoration that did not announce itself but that was impossible to ignore once seen. She turned slightly, and the skirt moved as she had intended, freely and fully, and without effort, and she felt the lining give the whole thing the weight and stability that kept it moving in one direction rather than several. She hung it carefully from the hook behind the door. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she lay down on the narrow bed with her hands folded over her chest, and she let the exhaustion of 2 days of concentrated work move through her body, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about tomorrow. She thought about what she had made and what she was going to walk into with it. She thought about the kind of room it would be and the kind of people who would be in it, and the way attention moved through a crowd. She thought about Maren and the brown dress, and the satisfaction that had been so visible in Maren's face. She thought about what Maren had been expecting to accomplish and what she would find instead. She felt, lying there in the dim room with the dress hanging behind the door, something she had not permitted herself to feel in 3 years, which was the clean, particular confidence of someone who has done exactly what they needed to do with exactly the resources they had, and who knows, in their hands and their bones as much as their mind, that what they have made is good. She closed her eyes, and in the morning she was going to put on what she had made, and she was going to go to the Duke's ball, and whatever happened after that would happen. She was not afraid of it. She had not been afraid of anything, she realized, since she had picked up the scissors. The morning of the ball was the kind of cold that arrives without ceremony and simply is. Alara opened the small window when she woke, and the air that came in was sharp enough to make her breathe differently, taking it in more carefully, the way you handle something that has edges. The sky was pale gray, the particular gray of autumn that is not quite overcast and not quite clear, that holds itself in a suspension between weather and could resolve in either direction by afternoon. She looked at it for a moment, and then closed the window and turned back to the room. The dress hung on the hook behind the door exactly as she had hung it the night before. She had half expected, in the small irrational way of someone who has made something important, to find it changed overnight, smaller or less or somehow less than the thing she remembered. It was not. It was exactly what it had been when she looked at it last, which was exactly what she had intended it to be. She dressed herself with care, beginning with the hair, which she dealt with alone as she dealt with everything, pinning it up with the several long pins she had been saving for this specific purpose. She had worked out the arrangement over several evenings in the previous weeks, pinning and unpinning, finding the way it needed to sit at the back of her neck to suit the line of the collar. It was not an elaborate arrangement. It did not try to be. It was clean and it was correct for what she was wearing, and it held without requiring more pins than she had or any assistance she would not receive. She put on the ivory dress carefully. She worked into it in the way that a well-made garment required, taking time with each element so that nothing was strained or hurried, letting the cloth settle around her the way cloth settled when it was cut and constructed correctly. She felt the lining give the gown its body and warmth. She adjusted the collar and checked that the cuffs sat where they were supposed to sit. She ran her hands down the front of the bodice and checked the waist seam and the fall of the skirt. Everything was as she had made it. She stood at the small glass and looked at what she could see. The glass was not large enough and not positioned correctly for a full view. She had never had a proper mirror in this room. What she could see was the bodice and the collar, the cuffs when she held her arms slightly forward, and the way the skirt began its fall from the waist. She looked at the embroidery in the morning light and found it different from the embroidery in candlelight, not less but differently itself, cooler and more precise, the pattern clear and finished and showing her nothing she would have changed. She turned to check the skirt, and it moved as it had moved the night before, freely, and with the quality she had built into it. She was ready. She went downstairs at the usual hour. Maren was at the table with the accounts in front of her, which was her habitual posture when she was thinking carefully about something she had not yet decided how to address. Alara poured herself tea and sat and ate her breakfast with the unhurried efficiency she brought to every meal. Maren looked up once when she came in and then looked back down at the accounts. The look had lasted a beat longer than the usual acknowledgement, not dramatically longer, but long enough. Alara noticed this and noted it and ate her breakfast. Irene came down dressed in the blue gown from the dressmaker's visits, which was a good color for her, and which she wore with the ease of someone who has worn good things long enough to feel entitled to them. She looked at Alara with the polished neutrality she used as a default in any situation she was uncertain about, and then she looked away and reached for the bread. Celia came down 20 minutes later with the particular energy of someone in whom anticipation has reached a level that is difficult to contain in ordinary behavior. She talked about the evening ahead with the enthusiasm that was the most honest thing about her, describing what she expected to see and who she hoped to meet, and what she had decided about her own appearance in the final hours of preparation. And this monologue was directed at no one specifically, and required no particular response. Alara listened to it with the peripheral attention she gave to things that were information without being addressed to her. Maren came downstairs last, as she always did when she wanted the timing of her arrival to communicate something, in a gown of deep burgundy that was extremely appropriate for the occasion, and that she wore with the composed authority of someone who had prepared for this and known they were prepared. She looked at Irene and made a small, precise adjustment to her eldest daughter's appearance, a thing at the collar, and then she looked at Alara. Alara looked back. What happened in that look was not simple. Maren was a controlled person, and her face communicated what she permitted it to communicate, no more. But she had not, as far as Alara could tell, permitted this expression entirely. It was the expression of someone who has been surprised by something specific, and is managing the surprise with the speed and skill of long practice, but has not entirely completed the management before the subject of the surprise has seen it happen. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Maren's face was composed again, and she turned to give Celia some instruction about the evening. She said nothing about the dress. This was the most significant thing about the whole morning. Alara had made a gown in 2 days from materials Maren had not known she had, using a skill Maren had never thought to assess, and she was standing in the breakfast room of the house in it, and Maren said nothing, not one word. Not the thing that had been designed as the contrast to the brown fabric, not the comment that would have communicated that Alara's effort was noticed and dismissed, not any of the things a person in Maren's position might have said. Just silence and the composed face and the instruction to Celia. Alara ate the last of her breakfast and set the cup down and stood. They walked to the carriage together, the 4 of them, and the carriage was brought to the door and they got in. Maren and Irene on one side, Celia and Alara on the other, and the carriage moved off the gravel drive and onto the road north, and the house fell away behind them. Alara sat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the countryside. The fields had been harvested and lay open in their late-season state, the particular brown of worked land after the crop has gone, with here and there a field that was still holding on to its color. The hedgerows along the road were in their autumn transformation, every shade of red and orange, and the particular deep yellow of leaves that have not yet given up. The sky stayed in its suspension above all of it, neither one thing nor the other. She thought about her mother, Clara Voss, who had burned soup and sung loudly and known what fabric wanted to do, and who would have had specific and enthusiastic opinions about every element of the evening ahead, shared freely before they left the house and at intervals throughout the journey. Alara let herself think about her mother without trying to hold any of it back, the way she sometimes did when she had the room for it. She let herself miss her with the full weight of it. Then she let it settle back to where it lived, which was close but not at the surface, and she went back to watching the countryside. She thought about her father, George Voss, who had stood at the window in the late afternoon and given the quality of the light his full attention, who had noticed things and let noticing be its own complete response to the thing noticed, not requiring it to lead anywhere, not using the noticing for anything except itself. She thought about what he would have said about this particular evening, about the dress and the carriage and what lay ahead. She thought he would have stood at whatever window was available and watched the light come through it, and that when he turned away his face would have had the particular quality it had in the years when her mother was alive, before the light went out of it. She thought that she was going somewhere he would have wanted her to go, and she thought that she was going there as herself, entirely and without apology. And she thought that this was the best possible thing she could do on a night that was, among other things, a night her father would have wanted to exist for her. She was still thinking about this when the carriage turned onto the long gravel drive of the Duke's estate, and the quality of the light through the window changed as the old oak trees on either side closed their canopy overhead. The estate appeared through the window as the carriage rounded the long curve. Alara looked at it with her father's habit of looking at things, which was directly and with the full attention that the thing deserved. It was a house that had been built by people who intended to live in it rather than to be seen living in it, which was not always the case with houses of this size and standing. The additions that different generations had made to the original structure had been made to serve a purpose rather than to demonstrate a capacity, and the result was a building that had grown into something natural rather than assembled into something intended. The stone was pale and old. The windows were tall and numerous, and had the quality of windows that had been admitting light into the same rooms for many generations. Lanterns had been lit along the approach as the afternoon turned to evening, and in the amber light of them the gravel looked warm. There were other carriages ahead of them in the drive. Alara watched the guests descending and moving toward the entrance, the movement of them organized by the event they were all attending, people finding the correct speed and direction without having to discuss it. Footmen in dark coats assisted at the carriage doors. The wide front steps were lit from below and above. Marin gave the driver his instructions about the hour of return and descended from the carriage with the ease of someone for whom this was a familiar kind of occasion. Irene followed and Celia after her, the three of them already in the slight rearrangement of posture that people make when they are about to be visible. Alara came down the carriage steps last, taking the footman's hand briefly, feeling the gravel steady under her feet, and she adjusted the line of her dress by instinct and she walked toward the entrance. The entrance hall was high and lit and full of sound, and the particular warmth of many people gathered in a closed space. The chandeliers above held dozens of candles, and the reflected light from the polished floor beneath them moved constantly as the doors opened and closed, a living quality to the illumination that made the room feel less static than it was. The assembled guests filled the space with the colors and movements of formal occasion, the women in gowns of deep color, the men in the dark coats that were their own kind of uniform, everyone arranged by habit and hierarchy into the patterns that occasions like this one produced naturally. Alara moved through the entrance hall with the attention she always brought to new spaces. She took in the ceiling, the proportions of the room, the paintings on the walls where there were gaps in the assembled guests. She took in the crowd's organization, who stood at the center of clusters and who moved at the periphery, who was being sought and who was seeking. She did not move quickly and she did not move hesitantly. She moved at the pace of someone who knew where she was and was not required to hurry. Marin found people she knew within the first 5 minutes and moved toward them with the directional purposefulness of someone executing a plan. Irene and Celia went with her, drawn into the orbit of the greeting, and the three of them became part of a larger cluster near the center of the hall and were absorbed. Alara did not follow. She had not expected to and she had not wanted to. She moved along the edge of the hall toward a set of doors that stood open at the far end, and passed through them into a longer and quieter space. The gallery. The walls were hung with paintings in heavy frames, large and dark with the weight of age on them. The crowd was thinner here. The guests who had found their way to the gallery were the ones who either genuinely wanted to look at the paintings or who wanted a moment of relative quiet in an occasion that was loud in the way large gatherings always were. Alara moved down the length of the gallery at a steady pace, looking at each painting as she passed, giving them what they deserved in terms of attention before moving on. She stopped in front of the one that stopped her. It was a landscape, a hillside in autumn, the particular late autumn when the color is almost gone and what remains is the quality of the light, rather than any color in the things the light falls on. It was painted with a skill that was immediately apparent, and that rewarded the kind of looking she had brought to it, which was close and unhurried and willing to find whatever was there. She looked at the sky, which was handled conventionally enough. She looked at the mid-ground, which was better than conventional. Then her eye moved to the lower right corner where the grass met a low stone wall, and she found what she had not expected to find, which was something exceptional. The painter had understood something about shadow that most painters did not understand, or understood and set aside in favor of the convention. The shadow on the near side of the wall was rendered without the blue that painters habitually put in shadows, the blue that was conventionally correct and actually wrong in this specific light at this specific season. This painter had looked at the actual shadow rather than the idea of it, and had made what they saw rather than what the tradition expected, and the result was a shadow that was true. You could feel the late autumn light without anything in the painting telling you what to feel about it. She was looking at the exact angle at which the shadow changed quality, at the specific place where the painter had made the decision that most painters would not have made, when a voice came from a few feet to her right. It was unhurried, it was not loud. It said simply that most people walked past that one. She turned. The man standing there was tall without using height as a social gesture, which some tall men did. His coat was good without announcing that it was good. His face had the quality of someone who had done a great deal of thinking and was not in the habit of displaying most of it. He was looking at her with attention that was curious rather than appraising, the specific attention of someone who has noticed something and wants to understand it rather than categorize it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the painting and said that the shadow in the lower right corner was wrong in exactly the right way. A pause. He said he would need her to explain that. She said that the painter had removed the blue from the shadow. She said that shadows appeared blue in certain conditions, and that painters who had learned to paint shadows from other paintings rather than from actual shadows put blue in them by instinct, because the convention was right often enough to be codified. She said that in this particular light, in late autumn in the afternoon, the shadow falling on the near side of that wall would have almost no blue in it at all, and the painter had understood this, and had painted what was actually there rather than what was expected to be there, and that this was the harder choice and also the correct one. He looked at the shadow for a long moment. Then he said that she had just made him want to look at this painting in a completely new way. She said that had not been her intention, it was simply what she had seen. He said that he found the distinction interesting. Then he said his name, Aldrich Renner. He said it as a name rather than a title, which was the choice a person made when they were speaking to someone they were actually interested in speaking to rather than someone they were required to acknowledge. She said she was Ilara Voss. He said it was good to meet her. And they both turned back to the painting and looked at the shadow that had no blue in it, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the silence was the kind that conversation makes when conversation has found something worth being quiet about. In the main hall, the evening continued without them. The music and the light and the arranged social patterns proceeded as they were designed to proceed, and across the room, Maren stood with her group and conducted her evening according to her plan, and she had not yet noticed that the plan had a particular kind of gap in it that she had not accounted for when she had designed the plan. The gap was Ilara. Ilara, who was supposed to be visible in a brown cleaning woman's dress in the Duke's formal rooms, and was instead standing in the gallery in ivory and cream embroidery, talking to the Duke about the shadow on a wall in a painting. Talking to him as though she had every right to be there. Because she did. The conversation that began in front of the painting did not behave the way conversations at formal occasions were supposed to behave. It did not move through the expected stages, the pleasantries about the music and the assembly, the careful inquiries about family and connection, the assessment of social position through the oblique but practiced methods everyone used at such gatherings. It did not do any of those things because neither of them steered it there, and the direction a conversation takes is determined by whoever is directing it. Aldrich asked her what else she could see in the painting that the painter had managed well. Ilara looked at the canvas with the attention she had brought to it from the beginning, which was the attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what they were looking at, and did not need to perform that interest. She said that the painter had understood something about the relationship between distance and color that was subtle and difficult to get right. The hills in the background were not simply muted and blue-gray, which was the conventional treatment of distant landscape, and was wrong in the particular way that conventions were often wrong, which was that they captured the general truth and missed the specific one. These hills were slightly warmer in their tone than the near foreground, which seemed counterintuitive, but was accurate for this angle of late afternoon light, when the sun was low enough to be striking the dry grass of the far hills and warming it in a way the shadowed foreground did not receive. Aldrich looked at the hills. He said he had looked at this painting many times and had felt something correct in those hills without being able to say what it was. He said it with the ease of someone who was entirely comfortable not knowing something, which was rarer than it seemed. She said that this was often how it worked. The feeling of rightness came before the understanding of it, and the understanding, when it arrived, was useful but not strictly necessary for the original feeling. He said he liked that. They moved along the gallery together, not having decided to move together but moving together because the conversation required it, requiring them to look at the same things. The next painting was a portrait of a woman from a generation or two past, formal in posture and expression in the way that official portraits required. Ilara looked at the woman's dress, rendered in thick folds of what appeared to be silk. She said the dress in the portrait was interesting, because the painter had looked at how the cloth actually behaved rather than how cloth was supposed to be painted to look like cloth. The folds were in the right places for the weight of the material, where gravity and movement and the structure beneath had actually put them, not where decorative convention would place them to look appropriately luxurious. Most painters of portraits painted the idea of fabric, she said. This one had painted fabric. Aldrich said he had never considered portraits from that angle. She said that she had reason to look at things from that angle. He asked what reason. She said that she made things with cloth, that it was the work she was most familiar with. He looked at her in the way she was already beginning to recognize as his specific way of receiving information, which was not the social reception of something said, but the actual receiving of it, incorporating it into whatever he was currently thinking. He asked what she had made most recently. She said the dress she was wearing. There was a pause. He looked at the dress, not the quick glance of someone checking for appropriateness or running through a catalog of what they recognized, but the slower attention of someone who has just been given specific information and is examining the object of it with that information in mind. He looked at the collar and the way the embroidery sat in the afternoon light that came through the gallery windows. He looked at the line of the bodice and the fall of the skirt. He looked for a while. Then he said, when? She said, in 2 days. He said, why 2 days specifically? Not as a skeptical question, but as a genuinely curious one, the question of someone who wants to understand a specific thing. She considered the simplified answer. The simplified answer was that she had simply decided to make something. The simplified answer was available and would have been easy. She looked at him, at the quality of attention he was directing at her, and the simplified answer felt like something that did not belong in this conversation. She said that she had been given a different garment to wear to this occasion, and had found it unsuitable, and had made an alternative. He was quiet for a moment. The quietness was the full kind, the kind where the person is actually thinking and not simply waiting for their next statement to arrive. Then he said that the alternative was considerably better than most things he had seen in the room tonight. She said she knew. The smile that this produced in him was not the performance that smiling at formal occasions usually was. It was the kind that arrived before the person decided about it, moving through the face in the way that real responses moved through faces before the composure of the occasion had a chance to intercept them. She noticed that she was glad to see it. There was a door at the end of the gallery that opened to the garden. They moved through it without discussing it, in the way that two people move in the same direction when the direction is obvious enough that naming it would be unnecessary. The garden outside was cold and formally laid out, low hedges in geometric patterns with gravel paths between them, small lamps set at intervals along the paths that turned the gravel a warm color in the early evening dark. The sound from the hall reached them softened by walls and the open air. They walked one of the paths without hurrying. She could hear the gravel under their feet and the distant music and the cold moving through the formal hedges. He said that he had been thinking about the northern field on his estate for 2 years and had not arrived at anything satisfying. The northern field was a piece of land at the top boundary of the estate that did not fit clearly into any existing use. It was north-facing, and the soil was a particular quality that he described with the precision of someone who had been looking at it for a while, not fertile enough for the most productive crops, and not poor enough to be written off entirely. It was the kind of land that required a decision rather than fitting itself to an obvious one. She listened to this and then asked about the slope. She asked about the water source and the distance to it. She asked about what had been tried there and what the results had been. He answered each question directly, as a person answers when they have been paying attention to the subject. She said that if the soil quality and the slope were as he described, and particularly given that the water source was close, there might be a strong argument for running it to meadow and managing it for hay. Not a dramatic answer, she said, but a reliable one. The output would be consistent relative to the work and the cost, which was a better equation than pushing arable use on land that was indifferent to it. He said he had not considered hay. She said it was not the answer that made an impression in conversation. He said that in his experience, the answers that made impressions in conversation and the answers that were actually useful were often different things, and that he had developed a strong preference for the latter. The cold was increasing as the evening settled into full dark. Neither of them moved to go inside for longer than was comfortable. When they finally returned through the garden door into the gallery, it was because the cold had become genuinely insistent rather than merely present. The hall beyond the gallery had shifted in their absence, the music more intentional now, the dancing begun, the crowd rearranged around the open space in the center of the room. He asked if she danced, she said yes. He asked if she would dance with him, she said yes. The floor was already occupied by a dozen or more couples when they joined it. She was aware, in the peripheral and measured way of someone who has noted something and stored it for later, that people noticed, not all at once. In the way that a crowd notices things in pieces, one cluster catching it and communicating it to an adjacent one, the awareness spreading outward from the original point of observation. The Duke of Renner County did not, apparently, typically spend the better part of his own gathering in conversation with a single person, and the single person he had spent it with tonight was a young woman no one appeared to recognize, in a simple ivory gown, standing on the floor with him. She noted this and returned her attention to the conversation and the dance. He danced without the self-consciousness of someone who had been formally taught and was always slightly aware of it. The teaching was present in the precision of the steps, but the self-awareness that usually came with formal instruction had been replaced by something more natural. He moved as though the steps had been forgotten as steps and had simply become the way he moved, which was what good teaching looked like when it had been absorbed. They talked while they danced, which was not the usual thing but which required no adjustment on either side because both of them were already in a conversation, and the dancing had simply joined it rather than replacing it. He said something about a book on construction techniques he had been reading, about the engineering problem of spanning a wide interior space without internal columns. She said that she found this problem interesting because it was structurally similar to the problem in clothing construction of making a garment hold its shape without internal scaffolding. The question in both cases being how to distribute load through the material so that nothing carried more than it could sustain indefinitely. He said he had never thought of structural engineering and clothing as versions of the same problem. She said that she found most things, looked at closely enough, were versions of the same problem. He looked at her while they moved through the steps of the dance with the particular attention that she was coming to understand was his specific manner of being with people or with things, the full focus attention that her father had brought to the quality of afternoon light. The dance ended and another began and they danced again, and between the sets they stood at the edge of the floor and the conversation continued without the interruption that most conversations experienced when the music started and stopped. It simply continued, finding new rooms to move through as it went. Across the room, Maren had stopped attending to the conversation she had been conducting and was attending to what was happening on the dance floor instead. Elara was aware of this in the peripheral corner of her attention that she maintained for Maren. She was aware of the quality of the stillness that settled over Maren when she was processing something that had not been in her plan. It was a particular stillness, not the ordinary stillness of a woman standing in a room, but the stillness of calculation, held inside the composed exterior. The first response came between the first and second sets of dances. Irene appeared at the edge of the floor with the natural inevitability of someone who happened to be moving in this direction on entirely unrelated business. Irene was very good at this. She had been trained for it by someone who was herself very good at it. She arrived near where Elara and Aldrich were standing with the ease of someone who had not been sent, but had simply arrived, and she addressed Aldrich with something pleasant about the music and the occasion. Aldrich was courteous. He gave Irene the complete courtesy that his position and his nature required. He was not rude and he was not dismissive, and he said the appropriate things in response to the appropriate things she had said. And then, as the music began again, he turned back to Elara with the naturalness of someone returning to a conversation that had been briefly paused rather than someone making a choice that communicated anything. Irene returned to Maren. Elara saw in her peripheral attention the brief exchange of expressions between them. The second approach came a quarter of an hour later, Celia this time, on a slightly different angle but the same objective. It lasted slightly less long than Irene's had. Aldrich was equally courteous and equally brief. Celia retreated. Marin stood very still near the refreshment table and revised her understanding of the evening. Ilara did not look at her. She was looking at Aldrich, who was saying something about the grandmother whose portrait hung in the northern room of the house, a portrait he had strong feelings about in relation to its frame. He said that the frame was wrong for the painting. He said the frame was too heavy and the gold of it too assertive, and that the effect was to diminish rather than display the painting, which was actually very good, better than most people realized because of the frame. She said that she had opinions about frames. He said he suspected she had opinions about most things. She said that this was accurate. They went to see the grandmother's portrait. It was in a smaller room off the gallery, quieter and less attended. The portrait was of a woman in middle age who looked directly out of the canvas with the expression of someone who was entirely clear about who they were and had no particular interest in performing this for the painter. Ilara liked her immediately. The painting was good in the way, the landscape in the gallery was good, specific rather than conventional, made by someone who had looked at the actual person rather than the idea of a portrait subject. The frame was, as he had said, wrong, too heavy and too insistently golden, the kind of frame that drew attention to its own presence rather than directing it toward the canvas. She said that the painting should be in a thinner frame, something with less assertion, something that contained the canvas without competing with it. He said he had thought the same thing for years and had never done anything about it. She asked why. He said that no one else had noticed it was wrong, and there was something slightly absurd about changing a frame when you were the only person who knew it needed changing. She said that being the only person who knew a thing needed changing was precisely the best reason to change it. He looked at her with the expression of someone being surprised in a way that was good rather than disconcerting. They stood in the small room with the grandmother's portrait for a while and talked about what they had looked at that evening and what they had found in it. The conversation had by now the quality of a conversation between people who have been talking for long enough that the surface conventions have been left behind, and what is left is simply two people being present in the same exchange. This was, Ilara had come to understand from the absence of it for 3 years, what conversation actually was when it was working. The rest of what passed for conversation was just sound arranged socially. When they moved back to the main hall, it was because the evening was nearing its conclusion rather than because they had finished. She understood, without having discussed it, that the conversation was not finished in any meaningful sense, and that this was not a problem. Unfinished conversations that were worth continuing had a way of continuing. A steward appeared at her elbow near the end of the evening. He was discreet in the practiced way of household staff at estates where discretion was a professional requirement. He placed a card in her hand and said nothing that required a response and moved away. The card had an address on it and the information that correspondence would be received and welcomed. She put it in the pocket that the dress had, which she had made because she always made her pockets for actual use. The gathering began to thin. Guests moved toward the entrance and the waiting carriages. She and Aldrich stood near one of the tall windows and the conversation was still going, because it had not yet come to a natural end, and she said something about the way the candlelight and the darkness outside a tall window created a visual effect that only existed inside the gathering and not outside it. The reflection of the room in the glass making the outside appear to contain another room, slightly less real and slightly more light. He said he had looked at that effect from this window at every ball he had ever hosted, and had never quite understood why it interested him. She said it was because the reflection showed you the room from outside the room, which was a perspective that was otherwise unavailable to you while you were in it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. Then he said that he thought that was exactly right. Outside in the drive, the carriages were assembling, and the last of the evening was concluding, and Ilara put on her coat and walked to the door with her hands in her pockets and the card between 2 fingers, and she thought about the shadow with no blue in it and the grandmother who had known who she was, and she thought that the evening had been exactly what she had made it to be, which was hers. The carriage home was a different thing from the carriage out. Marin sat very precisely and said nothing for the first hour. Irene looked at the dark fields, Celia fell asleep with her head against the carriage wall. Ilara looked out her window at the dark countryside and thought about everything and nothing, the long, slow thinking of someone who has done something that cannot be undone and is finding out what it feels like to have done it. Maren spoke once. She said without looking at Ilara that she supposed Ilara was pleased with herself. Ilara considered this. She said that she thought the evening had been interesting. Maren said nothing after that. The house appeared ahead in the dark, and the carriage slowed on the gravel, and the sound changed, and they were home. Ilara went upstairs without stopping and closed her door behind her, and stood in the small room with the card still in her hand, and the dress she had made still on her body, and the candle unlit, standing in the dark for a moment, and she thought about what begin meant in the mouth of a person who meant things precisely. Then she lit the candle and put the card in the box where she kept the things worth keeping and took off the ivory dress with the same care she had put it on with and hung it on the hook behind the door, and she sat on the narrow bed, and she let the evening be exactly what it had been. It had been enough. It had been considerably more than enough. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning at the end of the week after the ball, exactly when he had said it would arrive, which was already something she had noted about him, that when he said a thing, he meant it with the specific precision of someone who understood that words were not decorative. She was in the kitchen helping Harriet with the morning bread when Dot came in from the front of the house with the letter in her hand, and the carefully maintained expression of someone who had decided to have no particular knowledge of what they were carrying. Dot's face was not naturally suited to this kind of studied neutrality, and the effort showed in a way that was almost charming. Ilara took the letter without comment and went upstairs. She sat on the bed and turned the envelope over. It was addressed to her in handwriting that was the visual equivalent of his voice, direct and without unnecessary flourish, each letter formed fully and then left alone. She opened it. The letter said that he had thought about their conversation several times since the ball and had found that it continued in his mind in the particular way of conversations that have not actually finished, that keep going somewhere below the ordinary surface of the day and come forward when you stop directing your attention elsewhere. It said that the morning after the ball he had gone back to the gallery before any of his household was active, and had stood in front of the autumn hillside painting in the lower right corner where the shadow was, and had confirmed what she had told him about the absence of blue, and had been mildly annoyed at himself for having walked past this painting for an uncountable number of years without seeing it. It said that he had also looked at the tree line in the upper left, which she had mentioned on their way back from the garden, and that she was right about that as well, and that he had stood looking at the upper left corner for a considerable additional time absorbing this discovery. It said that he would like to call on her if she would receive him. It named 2 dates in the following fortnight, and said that if correspondence was preferable to a visit, he was equally content with that, and would follow her preference in this as in anything else. It was signed with his name and not his title. She read it twice and then sat with it for a while, not because she was uncertain about what to do but because she was being careful about it, in the way she was careful about things she considered important. She thought about what she was going to do next, and she thought about it from the full range of its implications rather than from any one angle. She thought about the trust and the solicitor and the information she had been carrying for 18 months. She thought about what begin meant in practice, what it required from her, what it made possible. She thought about the conditions she had been waiting for and whether this was them. She got out paper and wrote back. She said she would receive him and named one of the dates he had suggested. She said she had also gone back to think about the painting and had noticed something further about the relationship between the shadows on the near and far sides of the wall that she thought was worth discussing when she saw him. She said she would be glad to continue the question of the northern field if he had made any progress in his thinking about it. She said it was good to receive his letter. She folded it and sealed it and took it to Dot, who was given no information she was required to retain. The days between the letter and the visit had the quality of days between one thing and another, when the ordinary patterns of the household continued as they always had, but the texture of the time was different because something had changed in the structure beneath it. Ilara went about her usual work with the usual thoroughness, and she thought about what was coming without letting the thinking distract her from what was in front of her hands. This was a discipline she had been practicing for 3 years, and she was good at it. Maren watched her. This was not a new thing. Maren had always watched, in the particular way of someone who monitored the household the way a careful person monitored an account, looking for discrepancies, noting changes. What was new was the quality of the watching, which had shifted since the evening of the ball. It was more frequent now and slightly less disguised, as though the effort of making it invisible was something Marin had partially abandoned in the interest of being thorough. She said nothing directly. She managed the household as she always had, with precision and composure, and the only indication that anything was different was the way her eyes tracked Alara in a room with a consistency that had not been there before. Alara noted this and found it informative and moved through the household as she always did. The day of the visit arrived. She had prepared the small sitting room at the front of the house for the purpose, which meant that she had tidied it and arranged the furniture to allow for a comfortable conversation, and had made no other changes, because the room was not hers to change, and making it appear as though it would have been both inaccurate and unnecessary. She made tea herself in the kitchen, because the act of making it herself was consistent with the manner she intended to bring to everything, which was doing what she could do without requiring more from the situation than it offered naturally. Aldrich arrived on the hour. This was also something she had noted about him from the single previous occasion she had observed his use of time, which was that he did not use punctuality as a social statement, as some people did, arriving early to establish one kind of impression or late to establish another. He simply arrived when he said he would, because that was when he had said he would be there. Dot showed him to the sitting room with the carefully professional neutrality of someone who had very strong feelings she was not going to express. Alara was already in the room, sitting with the tea tray on the table in front of her, and she stood when he came in, and they greeted each other with the ease of people who had already spent several hours in each other's company, and for whom the social mechanics of a first formal meeting did not apply. He sat across the low table from her and took the tea she offered, and said that the drive north through her county was better than he had previously given it credit for. He said he had been paying more attention to the landscape than usual. She said she was glad. He looked at her with the attention she had come to associate with him specifically, the full focus attention that her father had brought to the late afternoon light. It was directed at people the same way her father had directed it at things, with the same quality of actually intending to see. She received it without wanting to move away from it, which was still interesting to her. The conversation that followed moved in the way their conversations moved, which was not predictably. It went to the painting, and from the painting to the question of what it meant to see something accurately versus conventionally, and from that to the book on construction techniques he had mentioned at the ball, and from the construction techniques to the question of the northern field, and from the northern field to the specific problem of managing land that was not suited to its neighboring land's use, and from that somehow to the question of what it meant to work with the nature of a material rather than against it. She told him about grain. She told him about the specific quality of different fabrics, and how understanding what a fabric wanted to do was the difference between fighting the cloth for the entire making of a garment and working with it so that the cloth itself contributed to the outcome. She said this was true of most materials. Stone had grain, wood had grain, land had grain. The north-facing slope with the particular soil he had described had a nature, and working with that nature was more productive than imposing a different purpose on it. He listened with his complete attention, and then said that he had never thought about land as having a grain. She said that her father had traded cloth for 20 years and had never thought about it that way either, and that she had only understood it by watching her mother work. He asked about her mother. She told him, in the way she found she was able to tell him things, which was directly and without softening them but also without making them more than what they were. She told him about Clara, who had burned soup and known what fabric wanted to do, and who had been gone since Alara was 16. She told him how she had learned from watching her mother explain what she usually did by instinct, and how the knowledge had come through the hands rather than through any formal teaching. He said that was a remarkable inheritance. She said it was the one she valued most. They disagreed about something during that conversation, a question about whether an unstable material could be made reliably stable through external structure alone, or whether the stability had to be inherent in the material. She said that she had found external structure to be a temporary solution, and that materials under sufficient stress always reverted to their true nature regardless of what you had done to the exterior. He said that he thought this depended on how the structure was applied, and whether it was applied in a way that worked with the material's natural tendency rather than against it. They worked through the argument together, both of them actually thinking rather than defending positions, and arrived somewhere neither of them had started, which was the conclusion that the question was not whether external structure could stabilize an unstable material, but whether the correct application of structure could change what the material considered stable. She said she was not entirely sure she agreed with that formulation. He said he was not entirely sure he did either, but it was the most accurate thing he could currently say. She found that she was very glad to be in a conversation that moved this way. When he stood to leave, he said that he had been thinking about her situation in the household. He said this without preamble, directly, in the manner she had come to expect from him. He said that what she had told him, taken together with what he understood about the arrangements that had been made after her father's death, suggested that there were questions that might reward closer examination by someone with the standing and resources to conduct that examination properly. He said that he had not done anything and would not do anything without her direction. He said the situation was hers, and the decisions were hers, and he wanted to be clear about that. She looked at him, she thought about the solicitor's office and the figures she had been shown, and the 18 months of silence she had maintained, while she waited for the right conditions. She thought about what begin meant and what it would require. She thought about the scissors and the ivory cloth, and the act of committing to a cut once you had finished thinking. She had finished thinking. She said that she had some information that was relevant to that question, and that she wanted to share it with him. And she told him all of it. The solicitor's letter 6 months after her father's death, the visit to the small office above the stationer's shop, the trust her father had established at her birth, properly set up and properly maintained, not large but real and incontrovertible, and entirely outside the arrangements Marin had made, the questions the solicitor had suggested might reward examination. The 18 months she had carried this in silence while she waited for the right moment. She told him clearly and in the correct order, the way she presented any piece of information she considered important, with the precision she brought to things that mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who did not know what to say, but the quiet of someone who had received a great deal of information and was incorporating it completely before responding. Then he said that she had been carrying that for 18 months. She said yes. He said she had told no one. She said she had been waiting for the right conditions. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said that she was one of the clearest-eyed people he had encountered. She did not know what to do with this precisely, so she said nothing. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and something was established between them that had been building from the first moment in the gallery in front of the painting, and was established now as a fact rather than a possibility. He left, she heard the carriage move on the gravel drive outside, and then the sound receding as the horse found its pace, and then the ordinary sounds of the house reasserting themselves. She sat in the sitting room for a while after he had gone. The tea things were on the table, and the room was quiet in the particular afternoon quiet of a house that was otherwise occupied elsewhere. She sat and thought about what she had just done, which was the thing she had been waiting to do, which was to take the information she had been keeping and place it in the conditions where it could be useful. She thought about whether this was the right moment. It was, she knew it with the same certainty she knew when a seam was right, which was in her hands before her mind completed the analysis. She picked up the tea things and carried them back to the kitchen and washed them herself, and she went upstairs to the small room, and she picked up the piece of work she had been doing before any of this began, a length of deep green wool she had found at a market in town, and which she was making into a warm garment for the winter, and she sat at the table with it and her needle, and she let her hands do what they knew how to do. And she thought, while she worked, that she had been patient for 3 years, and the patience had served its purpose, and that what came next was going to require a different kind of discipline, the discipline of someone who has moved from waiting to doing and must do with the same care they brought to the waiting. She was ready for that. She had been ready for that for a long time. She just had not had the right conditions until now. The visits continued. Every week at least, and sometimes twice, Aldrich came to the house and was shown to the small sitting room where Alara had the tea ready, and the conversation was always already in progress from wherever the previous one had left off. The continuity of it was something she had not expected and was careful not to take for granted, because she understood enough about the way things changed to know that this particular quality of conversation was not something to assume would simply persist without attention. But it did persist, and it required no effort to maintain. It simply continued being what it was. Harriet was not neutral about any of this. Harriet had known Elara since Elara was 7 years old, and had a loyalty to her that had been built from 15 years of proximity, and that had survived the household's transformation under Marin with the stubbornness of something very old and deeply rooted. She prepared small things for the tea tray on the days when the visit was expected, better things than usual, things she could account for as ordinary household expenses without them being detectable as what they were, which was Harriet demonstrating that she knew what was happening and approved of it. Elara thanked her each time without making a production of it. Harriet received the thanks with the practical brevity of someone who had not done anything that required thanks, which was the manner of someone for whom the action had been its own sufficient justification. Dot was also not neutral. Dot had never been particularly neutral about anything in the time Elara had known her. She managed her lack of neutrality with varying degrees of visibility depending on the day and the circumstances, and on the days of Aldrich's visits she managed it with somewhat less skill than on other days. The result was a quality of helpful attentiveness around the house on those mornings that was entirely transparent to Elara and apparently undetected by Marin, which said something about the limits of what Marin noticed when her attention was elsewhere. Marin's attention was largely elsewhere during this period. Irene's prospective match had moved to a stage that required significant social management on Marin's part, the careful navigation of a negotiation that was not acknowledged as negotiation, but that was conducted with all the precision of one. She was occupied with this in the way she was occupied with things that mattered to her plans, fully and with the organized focus that was her particular quality. This did not mean she stopped watching Elara. It meant her watching became slightly less frequent and slightly less focused, the way anything becomes slightly less focused when the person doing it has a great deal else to manage. Elara used the space this created not strategically but simply. She used it to be in the visits and the correspondence and the conversations without the additional effort of managing around close observation. She was always prepared to be observed, and never did anything that required it not to be. But the reduced observation made the period slightly lighter, in the way that removing a small and constant pressure makes everything lighter even when you had stopped noticing the pressure. The conversations in the sitting room went where they went. She learned more about Aldrich with each one, not the biographical facts but the actual substance of who he was, which was something assembled from what he found difficult, and what came easily to him, from where he was certain and where he was not, from what he noticed and what passed him by. He was good at large problems. He thought in structures and systems and could hold a complicated situation in his mind without losing track of any of its parts. He was less good at the small maintenance that kept large structures working, the constant attention to the ongoing details that kept everything from slowly unraveling. This was not a weakness he was unaware of. He knew it about himself and had found people for his household and his estate who were good at exactly that, which was itself a form of intelligence. He was genuinely interested in being wrong. This was the thing she found most remarkable about him, and the thing that was most difficult to find in people generally. Most people endured being wrong, accepted it as an occasional unavoidable condition, recovered from it with more or less grace. Aldrich was actually interested in it, the way a person is interested in a tool that is useful to them. When she disagreed with him and she was right, the expression on his face was the expression of someone receiving something useful, not someone experiencing a loss. She tested this, not deliberately, not as an experiment, but in the natural course of conversation that was honest rather than managed. She said things she believed when she believed them and disagreed when she disagreed and pushed back when she thought the reasoning was incomplete. Each time the response was the same, attentive and genuinely incorporating. She had been in enough conversations with enough people to understand how rare this was, and understanding how rare it was made her careful with it in the specific way you are careful with rare things, not precious about them but attentive, not taking them for granted. She also told him things she had not told anyone else, not confessional things, not the working out loud of feelings she was unsure about. She told him things she had thought through thoroughly and kept because there was no one to tell them to, observations about the household, assessments of her situation that were clear and accurate. The plan she had been assembling, from the trust and the solicitor's information and the patience she had practiced, and the way she had understood it all along as temporary and had chosen to treat it as temporary rather than permanent, which was the difference between enduring a situation and choosing to remain in it until the conditions for changing it were right. He listened to all of this with the full attention he brought to everything, and then said carefully that he thought she had been more strategic than circumstances had required her to be. He said it without criticism. He said it as something he found interesting. She said she thought she had been practical. She said there was a difference between strategy and practicality, the difference being that strategy was about winning something and practicality was about getting to the right place by the most reliable route. She had not been trying to win anything. She had been trying to get somewhere. He said he thought that distinction was important and that he was going to think about it further. She said she had thought it through for 3 years and was available for the discussion whenever he was ready. He smiled in the way she had catalogued by now as the specific smile that came when something she said surprised him in a way that pleased him. It appeared before he decided about it. She had decided that she liked this about him very much. On the third visit, he told her something about the estate that was personal, in a way the other things he had told her had not been. He told her that the estate had always been his father's in a way that he did not think estates could properly be any single person's, because estates were the product of many generations and would outlast any individual's tenure in them, but that his father had carried the estate as though it were a burden specific to him rather than a continuity he was participating in, and that this had made certain things about running the estate very difficult to learn from him, because the way his father did them was embedded in his father's specific feelings about the weight of the responsibility rather than in the actual requirements of the work. Alara said that she understood this from a different angle, which was that her father had carried his business as a thing he had built himself, and that when he died the transition of it to Marin had been facilitated by the fact that he had not thought to separate what was the business and what was his particular relationship to it, because he had not expected to be separating them. Aldrich said that was the same problem in a different form. She said yes. He said that both of them had been given things that were partly the thing itself and partly the specific person's experience of the thing, and that what they had each needed to do was find the thing underneath the person's experience of it. She said that she had found it. She said it had taken 3 years, and it had required patience she had not expected to need. He said that he thought she had done it in a way his father never had, which was to find the thing without losing herself in the finding of it. She looked at him when he said this. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said that her mother had always told her that the most important thing about working with a material was not to forget what you were making it into, that the cloth was not the end, the garment was the end, the cloth was what you were working with to get there. He said that was a better way of saying what he had meant. She said she had had 20 years of her mother teaching her how to say things precisely. On the 4th visit, he said something different from everything he had said before. The conversation had moved through several of its usual rooms and had arrived at a quiet place, the kind of place where conversation goes when it has been going long enough that the people in it are comfortable with the space around the words. He looked at her across the low table, and he said that he had been thinking about something that he wanted to say, and that he had thought about how to say it, and had concluded that the most accurate way was also the most direct way, and that this was usually the case in his experience, so he was going to say it directly. She waited. He said that he was aware of the difference in their current circumstances, and that this awareness was present in his thinking, but was not the primary thing in it. He said the primary thing was the conversations they had been having and the way he thought in the time between them. He said that he had noticed that the thinking he did in the time between the visits had changed since the visits had begun, that it had more room in it and more of the quality of actually considering things rather than simply processing them. He said he attributed this to having someone to think against, which was what he found in her, a person whose thinking made his better rather than simply agreeing with it or avoiding it. He said he wanted to ask whether she would consider something more formal, whether she would allow him to put the thing they were already doing on a footing that reflected what it actually was. She looked at the table for a moment, she looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. She said yes. She said it in the same way she had said it in the gallery at the ball, which was simply and cleanly, without ceremony. The word that was the conclusion of having thought through something completely and having found that the answer was clear. He looked at her with the expression she had found most characteristic of him at moments of arrival, which was not the expression of triumph or relief exactly, but something quieter and more specific, the expression of someone who has come somewhere they were navigating toward and finds themselves, against the uncertainty of navigation, actually there. They stayed in the sitting room for another hour after that, not because anything more needed to be said about what had been decided, but because the conversation was still going and neither of them wanted to end it. And an hour of talking about the northern field and the grandmother's portrait, and the question of what structural grain meant in the context of families rather than materials was a good enough way to end an afternoon. He left. She heard the carriage. She sat for a while. She thought about the bolt of ivory cloth she had kept for years without knowing what it was for. She thought about the 2 days and the brown fabric and the scissors and the grain of the cloth and what her hands had known how to do when she sat down at the table and began. She thought about what begin meant and what it led to when you let it lead where it was going. She thought that the right moment had arrived and that she had been ready for it and that 3 years of patience had been worth what they had cost. She got up and went to the kitchen and told Harriet that dinner would need to be a little earlier tonight because she had some correspondence to write and needed the evening. Harriet looked at her with the expression she used when she knew something and was choosing to know it without comment. She said dinner would be at 6. Alara went upstairs. She sat at the table with paper and pen, and she wrote a letter to the solicitor in the next county, Peter Fowler, telling him that the moment had arrived and that she was ready to proceed, and that she would come to his office at his earliest convenience to discuss next steps. She sealed the letter, she addressed it, she set it on the table for Dot to take in the morning. Then she sat back and looked at the small room that had been her room for 3 years, the narrow bed and the small window and the hook behind the door where the ivory dress was still hanging, and she thought about all the evenings she had sat here with her needle and her work and her quiet and the thing she was waiting for. She had not been waiting for rescue. She had been waiting for the right conditions, which was something else entirely, a distinction that mattered to her and that she would have wanted to explain to anyone who confused the two. The conditions were right. She was not waiting anymore. Peter Fowler received her at his office above the stationer's shop on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after the letter. The room was the same as it had been 18 months before, the same careful clutter, the same filing of papers along every available horizontal surface, the same quality of accumulated professional work that was organized according to a system that belonged entirely to the person who had built it and was resistant to any other reading. He had aged slightly in the time since she had last seen him, or she was seeing the age that had been there before and noticing it more now. He was past 60 and had the manner of a man who had seen enough of human financial arrangements to be unsurprisable by them. He offered her tea, she accepted. He said that he was glad she had written. He said that he had been wondering, in the time since their last meeting, whether the moment he had described would arrive in the form it needed to arrive in, and that he was glad to hear that it had. She told him about Aldrich Renner. She told him about the visit to the ball and the conversations that had followed and what had been decided. She told him about the trust and about Aldrich's standing and resources and the willingness he had expressed, clearly and more than once, to direct those resources in the direction the situation required if she chose to use them. Fowler listened to all of this with the expression of someone hearing a story whose ending they have been hoping for. When she finished, he said that this was considerably better than he had expected the situation to resolve to in the time available. He said he had thought it might take longer. He said that in his experience situations of this kind, where one party held most of the formally arranged power and the other party held the actual claim but lacked the standing to press it, resolved well only when certain external conditions were met, and that the conditions she had described were precisely the ones required. She said she had understood that from the beginning. He said he had suspected as much. She said she wanted to know what the process looked like from this point, in practical terms, step by step, so that she could think clearly about what she was committing to. He laid it out for her. It was methodical and it was not quick, and the methodical, not quick quality of it was not a problem but a feature, the quality of a process designed to be thorough rather than impressive. There would be a formal examination of the arrangements made at her father's death by a solicitor appointed for the purpose. That solicitor would need access to the original documents, which Fowler believed he could obtain through proper channels with the assistance of a party of sufficient standing. The trust documents would be presented. Certain questions about the legality of some of the transfers would be raised and would require answers that the party being questioned, being Marin, would need to provide. The process would take some months. At the end of it, the picture would be clear, and the arrangements would reflect what was actually true rather than what had been arranged to appear true. She said she understood. He said that the key practical point was that the party with sufficient standing to make the examination possible needed to be willing to pursue it through whatever resistance it encountered, because resistance was likely, and he wanted her to know that in advance. She said she had discussed this with Aldrich Renner, and that he had been explicit about his willingness to sustain the process to its conclusion. Fowler looked at her over his papers with the expression of a man who has practiced not showing what he was feeling for long enough that most things no longer required the practice. But there was something in his face, a kind of satisfaction that was quieter than pleasure but more durable, the satisfaction of someone who believed in the principle of things being set right and occasionally got to see it happen. He said he would write to the solicitor he had in mind and begin the arrangements. She thanked him, finished her tea, shook his hand, and went back to the house. She told Aldrich about the meeting on his next visit. She told him what Fowler had said, and what the process would look like, and approximately how long it would take, and what would be required of him in terms of standing and resources and willingness to sustain it through to the end. She told him all of this as she told him everything, directly and completely, with the assumption that he could receive the full picture and think about it clearly. He received it exactly as she had assumed he would. He said he had already spoken with his own solicitor in a preliminary way, that he had wanted to understand the landscape before going further, and that his solicitor's assessment confirmed Fowler's in its broad structure. He said that what was required of him was straightforward, and that he was ready to proceed whenever the arrangements were in place. She said she appreciated that he had done the preliminary work without waiting to be asked. He said that once she had told him about the trust, it had seemed obvious what the next practical step was, and that waiting to be asked before taking an obvious practical step was not a habit he had found useful in the management of anything. She said she had reached the same conclusion independently. He said he supposed they would find that they had reached the same conclusion independently on a great many things. She said she supposed so, and that she was looking forward to finding out which ones they hadn't. The process, once it began, moved with the methodical pace that Fowler had described. There were letters and meetings, and the presentation of documents in the correct order to the correct people. Aldrich's solicitor and Fowler worked through the details together with the professional thoroughness of two people who understood that thoroughness was what made this kind of process work. Ilara was consulted on everything that required her input and left alone on everything that required theirs. She had always been good at understanding which kind of task she was in and behaving accordingly. Marin received a formal letter from the solicitors on a Wednesday morning. Ilara knew this because Harriet told her, with the contained satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for a long time for something to happen and had not been wrong to wait. Harriet had been in the corridor adjacent to the sitting room when Marin read the letter, not by accident, with the perfect proximity of someone who happened to be working nearby and was paying no particular attention to anything. What Harriet saw and reported with admirable precision was Marin reading the letter standing up, then reading it again sitting down, then sitting for a long time with the letter in her hands not doing anything at all. This was the most information Harriet had ever offered about Marin's private behavior in all the years she had been in the household. That she offered it now said something about what she thought of what was happening, and about the relief that even a person of Harriet's loyalty and discretion eventually needed to express. Ilara said she appreciated the information. Harriet said there was nothing to appreciate. She went back to the kitchen. The weeks that followed had the particular texture of a change happening below the surface of the ordinary. The household looked the same from the outside and ran the same, and the meals came at the same hours and the routines continued. But something had shifted in the structure beneath all of it, in the weight-bearing arrangement, and the shift was not yet visible in the surface, but was present in the way the surface felt. Ilara moved through it with the same composed efficiency she always had and felt the shift without commenting on it. Marin said nothing directly to her, not about the letter and not about the solicitors and not about what the solicitors were doing. She managed the household and managed her daughters and managed her social obligations with the precision she had always brought to these things, and in the sitting room and at the dinner table she was composed and correct. The only visible indication that anything was different was the watching, which had intensified again after the weeks of partial distraction, and had a different quality now. It was no longer the watching of someone monitoring a situation they understood and were managing. It was the watching of someone who had found that the situation they thought they understood was more complex than they had known, and who was revising their understanding while everything continued to move. Ilara did not feel triumph about this. She had thought about what she would feel in the weeks before the process began, and she had expected to feel something sharper and more immediate than what she actually felt. What she felt was closer to the feeling she had when a piece of work was close to done but not finished yet, the particular quality of not yet that made the present moment meaningful without requiring anything from it except being in it. She worked on the green wool garment in the evenings. She was close to finishing it. The work went well, the way it went when she was in the right relationship to it, not forcing it and not holding back, simply following what it required. Aldrich came twice in the week, after the solicitor's letter went to Marin. On the first visit, he said the process was moving as expected and Fowler and his solicitor were in regular communication. On the second visit, he said that the examination of the original documents from the period of her father's illness had raised the specific questions he and Fowler had anticipated, and that the other party would be required to respond to those questions within a formal period. She asked how long. He said 4 to 6 weeks for the formal response, and then the assessment of the response would take additional time after that. She said she had waited 3 years. She could wait another 6 weeks. He said he thought that was extremely steady. She said she had always found that patience was steadiest when you understood exactly what you were waiting for. He said quietly that he was glad to be what she was waiting for. She looked at him. She said she meant the legal resolution, not him, because she did not need to wait for him. That part was already clear. He said that he understood that, and that the distinction did not change what he had said. She said she knew. They were in the sitting room, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle it came through in late autumn, the angle her father had stood at windows to watch, and the room was warm from the fire that Harriet had lit before his arrival. She felt the warmth and the light, and the quality of the moment with the full attention she brought to things that were worth bringing full attention to, which was the capacity she had inherited from her father. She thought that he would have liked this, not the legal arrangement or the formal proceedings. He would have liked the quality of the afternoon and the warmth of the room and the particular kind of conversation happening in it. He would have stood at the window for a moment and watched the light change, and then he would have turned back to the room with the expression she had loved most, the expression of someone who has seen something beautiful and has given it all the attention it deserved. She let herself have that thought completely, in the way her father had let himself have the afternoon light completely, and then she let it settle back to where it lived, and she turned back to the conversation. And the conversation continued, as it always did, finding its next room and moving into it, and the afternoon light shifted through the window and the fire held its warmth, and outside the season moved steadily toward its conclusion. The green wool garment was nearly done. She could see the end of it from where she was. She would finish it this week, she thought, and then she would begin something else. She always began something else. That was the thing about making things. You finished and then you began, and the beginning was always its own complete thing, and what you had made before it was still there, finished and real, and what you were making now was present and in progress, and the whole of it together was the shape of a life built in a particular way, with hands that knew what to do and the patience to do it and the clear thinking to know when to cut and when to hold the scissors, and when to simply let the work tell you what it needed next. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. She was only beginning to understand how far it would take her. The formal response from Marin's side of the proceedings arrived in the 5th week, not the 6th, which Fowler said was slightly faster than he had expected. He sent word to Ilara through the proper channels they had established for communication, which was a brief note delivered by his clerk to the house and addressed, on the outside, to Ilara Voss on a household matter, a description that was accurate and unrevealing. She read it in her room and sat with it for the length of a cup of tea. The response, Fowler's note told her, had done what these responses typically did, which was acknowledge certain facts while framing others in the most favorable possible interpretation of the circumstances. It did not, he said, materially alter the shape of the question that was being examined. It simply meant the examination would now move to its next stage, which was the assessment of the response against the documents already gathered, the drawing of conclusions, and the formal articulation of those conclusions in the terms that would determine what happened next in practical terms. She wrote back confirming she understood and asking whether any further information or documents were needed from her at this stage. Fowler replied that everything currently in hand was sufficient and that he would write again when there was something requiring her attention. And so she waited, which was not different from waiting in any other period of her life, except that the thing she was waiting for was clearly visible now, close enough that she could see its shape, and waiting for something clearly visible was different from waiting for something that had only been a possibility. She finished the green wool garment in the first days of that week. She held the finished thing up and looked at it with the satisfaction she always felt when something was done and was what it had been intended to be. It was a good, warm piece of work. She folded it with the care she brought to finish things and set it in the box where she kept what she made, and then she looked at the box of materials and thought about what came next. She had a piece of blue-gray wool she had been thinking about for some time. It was a heavier weight than the green, a wool that wanted to be something substantial and durable rather than elegant, something that would wear for years and improve with wear in the way that good wool improved. She took it out and laid it on the table and ran her hands over it in the way she always began, feeling the grain and the weight and the particular nature of the material, letting it tell her what it was before she decided what to make it into. She thought, while her hands were on the cloth, about what Fowler had said, about the situation being close to its resolution. She thought about what resolution meant in practice, not just legally but in terms of the shape of the days that came after. She had thought about this before in the abstract, but the abstract had always stopped short of something specific because the specific was dependent on conditions that had not yet been established. The conditions were established now, and she let herself think in more particular terms about what came next. What came next was a house that was not this house. She had known this in some form since Aldrich had asked her in the sitting room, and she had said yes, and the word had settled into what it meant. A house that was his but in which there would be room for her to be entirely herself, the way the conversation they had been having for months had room in it for her to be entirely herself, without management or performance or the careful maintenance of a position that was not quite real. She thought about what that felt like from the inside and found that it felt like the cloth under her hands, honest about its weight and its nature, no pretense in it. She thought about her mother's workroom. In the house she had grown up in before any of this, there had been a room off the main corridor that was her mother's, filled with fabric and thread and the particular organized clutter of a person who worked seriously and used their workspace as a thinking space as much as a physical one. Ilara had not had a room like that. She had had the small room at the back of the house and the table by the window and the light from the candle and the small box of materials. She had done good work in it. She had made the ivory dress in it. But it was a small room, and the work it had contained was small room work, managed within limits that were imposed rather than chosen. She was going to have a different room. She did not think about this with urgency. She thought about it the way she thought about the work before she began it, which was with the attention of someone who is finding the grain of a thing before committing to it. She turned the image of it over and felt where it was right, and where it needed adjusting and where she was not yet sure. She thought about what she needed in a workspace and what she would want, and how those two lists were related. She thought about the light and the storage and the table, and the tools she did not yet have and might now be in a position to acquire. Aldrich knew she sewed. He had known this since the first evening in the gallery when she had told him the dress was her own work. He had never treated this as incidental or purely domestic. He had always asked about it the way he asked about everything she told him, as a thing worth understanding. She thought about telling him about the room, not asking, telling him in the way she told him things rather than asking for them, sharing the thinking because that was what she did, and he was the person she shared the thinking with. She thought she would tell him on his next visit. She picked up her scissors and began to think about the blue-gray wool. Aldrich's next visit was 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon. The light in the sitting room was the winter light, lower and more lateral than the autumn light had been, coming through the window at an angle that turned everything it touched slightly more definite around its edges. She had noticed, in the months since the visits began, that she had started noticing the quality of light again, in the way she had not since her father was alive. and she thought this was because she was spending time with someone who thought about things the way her father had thought about things, attending to them with the full seriousness of someone who believed that things were worth attending to. She told him about the room. She said that she had been thinking about workspace. She said that what she currently had was adequate for the work she had been doing and inadequate for the work she intended to do. She said she had some particular thoughts about what she needed in terms of light and table space and storage for materials. She said she was not making a request. She was telling him what she was thinking. He listened with the full attention, and then said that the estate had several rooms in the north wing that had not been used for any specific purpose for some years, and that he had been wondering for some time what to do with them. He said that one of them in particular had a quality of north light that he had always thought was wasted on an unused room. She said north light was correct for the kind of work she did. South light was bright but variable. North light was consistent, which was what you needed when you were assessing the color and quality of fabric and making decisions that would look the same under consistent light as they did under the light of the decision. He said he had not known that. She said there was no reason he would have. He said there was now. She said yes. They talked about the room for a while, the practical specifics of it, the dimensions and the light, and what it would need to be useful in the way she intended. He answered questions about the dimensions from memory, and she thought about what those dimensions meant for a table of the size she wanted and the storage she needed. She made calculations in the way she made calculations, in her head, running through the geometry of the space as he described it. It came together in a way that made sense. She said she thought it would work. He said he was glad. She said she was going to need a particular kind of table. She said that most tables were the wrong height for close work over an extended period, too low, which forced a posture that was the reason most needlewomen had problems with their backs and necks as they got older. She said she had thought about the correct height for years and had never been in a position to have a table made to it. He said he would have a table made. She said she was not asking. He said he knew. He said he was offering because he thought the table was a good idea, and because having the right tools for work that mattered was something he believed in as a principle. He said he had several tools on the estate that he had paid to have made to a specification because the standard versions were wrong for the purpose, and that the investment had been worth it every time because the correct tool changed the quality of the work, and the quality of the work was the point. She said she agreed with that. He said he knew. She looked at him across the low table and the winter light and the ordinary warmth of the afternoon, and she thought about the bolt of ivory cloth she had kept for years without knowing what it was for, and about the 2 days of work that had made it into something, and about the gallery and the shadow with no blue in it, and about the word begin. She thought that things had a grain and you could feel it in your hands if you paid attention, and that paying attention was itself a form of understanding, and that she had been paying attention her whole life, and was now in the part of the story where the attention had led somewhere, and the somewhere was here in this room on this afternoon, with this person across the table who was asking about the height of a table, because he understood that the right tool changed the quality of the work. She thought that her parents would have liked him. She thought her father would have stood at the window of the north room with the good north light, and watched the quality of it change through the afternoon, and he would have turned back with the expression of someone who has seen something worth seeing. She thought her mother would have had very specific and enthusiastic opinions about the table. She thought that she had been right to be patient, right to keep the ivory cloth until the right thing, right to wait for the conditions that made the action useful rather than merely possible. She thought that 3 years of managing what she had in a small room had not diminished her, but had simply been the time it took for what she was building toward to come into view. She thought all of this with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, fully and without hurry and with her hands still in her lap, and then she let it settle back into the ordinary warmth of the afternoon. Outside the window the winter light was doing what it did in winter, moving across the sky in a lower arc and reaching everything at a different angle, and the quality of it in the room was the quality her father had loved, the particular late afternoon quality that only existed for a few minutes, and that rewarded the person who stood still enough to watch it change. She was watching it. And when it changed, she turned back to the conversation, and the conversation continued. The formal conclusions of the legal examination arrived in a letter from Fowler in the 2nd week of the new year. The letter was longer than his previous ones, and was written in the specific careful language of a man who wanted to be precise, and also wanted the recipient to be in no doubt about what he was saying. He said the examination was complete. He said the conclusions were what he had anticipated they would be when he had first spoken to her 18 months before. He said the trust was confirmed as hers in full. He said that the questions about certain other transfers had been resolved in a way that was formal and final. He said that the practical implications of these conclusions were significant, and that he would like her to come to his office at her earliest convenience so that they could discuss what happened next. She read this letter twice in her room in the early morning with the house still quiet around her. Then she put it in the small box where she kept the things worth keeping, next to the card from the Duke's estate and the small photographs her father had kept, and a piece of thread from the first garment her mother had ever helped her finish. She sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap and the early morning quiet around her. Then she got up and went to write to Fowler. The resolution of the legal proceedings had the quality she had expected it to have, which was not dramatic. There was no confrontation. There was no scene. There was a series of formal communications between solicitors and a set of signed documents, and a meeting in Fowler's office at which the practical arrangements were explained and confirmed, and Alara sat across from him and said yes and yes and yes at the appropriate moments, and asked the questions she needed to ask and received answers that were accurate and sufficient. Maren was informed through formal channels. There was no private conversation between them about it. Alara had thought about whether she wanted that conversation and had decided she did not. What there was to say had been said through the proper process, which was more complete and more binding than anything that could be said in a sitting room. She passed Maren in the corridor the morning after the formal conclusion was communicated, on her way downstairs to breakfast. Maren was coming out of her room. They looked at each other for a moment. Maren's face was composed in the way it was always composed. Alara's face was what it always was, attentive and without performance. Neither of them said anything. That, Alara thought, was the right amount. She left the house on a morning in late winter when the sky was white, and the cold was the clean, dry cold that comes just before the year begins to turn toward something warmer. She did not leave dramatically. She left the way she had always moved through everything, which was with attention and without performance, doing what needed doing in the order that made sense. She had packed the week before. There was not much. She had come to understand, in 3 years of living with very little that was actually hers in the house, what she genuinely needed and what she had only thought she needed. The distinction was clarifying in a way that difficult circumstances sometimes were, though she would not have chosen the difficulty for the clarification if she had been given a choice. The small box of materials, the box of things worth keeping, the pieces of cloth she had gathered over years. The tools she had accumulated through the same patient process of saving and choosing carefully. She went to the hook on the back of the door. The ivory dress hung where it had hung since the night of the ball. She had kept it there rather than folding it away because she wanted to see it, because it was the work she was most proud of, not in the sense of vanity but in the sense of accuracy, the thing she had made that was most precisely what it needed to be, under the most specific constraints, in the least available time, from the least obvious materials. She had looked at it many times in the months since the ball and had not found anything she would change, which was the standard she applied to finished work rather than any external standard. She took it from the hook and folded it carefully. She placed it in the box with the things worth keeping, next to the card from the estate, next to the thread from her first finished garment, next to the small photographs of her parents that she had retrieved from the place Maren had stored them, which was in the back of a drawer in the old study rather than anywhere it could be seen and remembered. She put on her coat. She picked up the boxes. She went downstairs. Harriet was in the kitchen. Alara had told her the evening before, privately, that she was leaving in the morning and what was happening and what it meant. Harriet had listened with the expression of someone receiving news they had been hoping for long enough that the receiving of it required some adjustment. She had said nothing for a moment. Then she had said that she would make sure the boxes were ready to go on the carriage, and that Alara should eat a proper breakfast before she left, because it was a cold morning. This was Harriet's way of saying everything she felt about the situation, which was considerable, and Alara received it as everything it was, and thanked her for it and had, in fact, eaten a proper breakfast, because Harriet had asked her to and because the breakfast was good, and because it was the last morning she would eat Harriet's cooking in this kitchen, and that was worth being present for. Harriet was not in the kitchen when Alara came downstairs with the boxes. She came through from the scullery after a moment with the precise timing of someone who had been listening for footsteps and had waited until the correct moment to appear. She took one of the boxes from Alara without asking. She carried it to the front door. She set it down. She straightened up. She said that Alara should write when she was settled. Alara said she would. Harriet said that if any of her current position at the household was being reconsidered, she would not be averse to a conversation about other arrangements at some point, framing it in the specific careful terms of someone who was making a professional inquiry rather than an emotional one, though the emotion was entirely present. Alara said she would be in touch about that at the earliest opportunity, and that she thought the probability of a conversation being useful was high. Harriet said that was good. She held the front door open. Alara went through it. The morning air was cold and clean and immediate. Her breath made small clouds in it. The gravel under her feet was the same gravel it had always been, and it made the same sound it had always made. The carriage was at the end of the drive with the horses standing in the cold, with the patient quality of horses that have been doing this for long enough to find it ordinary. She put the boxes in the carriage and she got in. She did not look at the house. Not from bitterness, and not from the effort of preventing bitterness. Simply because the house was behind her, and what was relevant now was in front of her, and she had always found it more useful to direct her attention toward where she was going rather than where she had been. The carriage moved, the drive went past, the gate went past, the road opened in front of her. The road north was the same road she had traveled to the ball in autumn, but it looked different in winter and under different conditions of traveling it. In autumn she had been going toward something uncertain. Now she was going toward something that she had thought through and chosen and understood. These were different experiences of the same road. She watched the countryside move past the window. The fields were in their winter state, the soil dark and empty, waiting for the next planting. The hedgerows had lost most of their color and were the bare winter version of themselves, which was also beautiful, differently beautiful, the beauty of a structure revealed without its covering, the skeleton of the thing showing clearly for the first time. She looked at the hedgerows with the attention she had given everything she considered worth attending to, and she thought that there was something right about seeing a thing in its essential form, the thing it was when you had removed the layers that added to it but were not it. She was in her essential form now. She had been moving toward it for 3 years. Or perhaps she had always been in it, and what had changed was the conditions that allowed it to be visible and to operate as itself, rather than as the managed, constrained version of itself that difficult circumstances required. She thought about what she was going to do in the north room with the north light. She had already been thinking about it for the weeks since Aldrich had described it, running through the possibilities with the part of her mind that was always working on what to make next, the part that did not rest when the hands were still but continued making decisions and setting up problems and working through the geometry of the next piece when everything else was occupied with something else. She had a project in mind. Something larger than anything she had attempted in the small room, larger in every sense, more ambitious in its design and in the quality of its execution. She had the materials for the beginning of it in the box in the carriage. She had the rest of what she needed identified and knew where to acquire it. She thought about the table being made to the correct height. She thought about this with the specific satisfaction of someone who has always had a tool that was slightly wrong for the purpose and is now going to have one that is right. The slightly wrong tool was usable and she had used it for years without complaint because it was what she had. But the right tool would change things, not the fundamental skill which was in her hands and not in the tool, but the ease of it. The sustainability of it. The difference between work done at the right height and work done at a height that was a chronic small correction. Her mother had always had the right tools. She was going to have them now. The road moved through the winter landscape, and the carriage rocked on its springs, and the horses made steady progress toward the north, toward the estate with the long gravel drive and the old stone, and the room with the north light that had been waiting for someone to use it for something. She thought about the grandmother in the portrait, the woman who had looked directly out of the canvas with the expression of someone who was entirely clear about who they were, and required no performance of it. She thought that she understood that expression better now than she had the first time she saw it, standing in the small room off the gallery with Aldrich while they talked about frames. She thought that the grandmother had probably had a long journey to that expression, and that the portrait had been painted somewhere in the middle of the journey rather than at its beginning or its end, and that the expression was the expression of someone who had paid the cost of knowing themselves and had found the cost worth it. She felt, in the carriage on the winter road with the boxes beside her and the cold outside the window, something that she identified after a moment as the feeling of things being in their correct proportion. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was somewhere in it. Something more like the feeling of a seam that has been set correctly, a thing that is where it belongs and holding the weight it was made to hold. The feeling was not dramatic, it did not announce itself. It was simply present in the way that correct things were present, quietly and completely. She thought about the brown fabric inside the ivory dress, folded inside the box in the carriage. She had thought about it many times since she had made it. The brown fabric that had been given as humiliation and had become the lining, invisible inside the structure, giving the whole dress its weight and holding its form through an entire evening of wearing. She had never taken it out. She had kept it where she had sewn it, inside the finished thing, where it did its work without being seen, where it was part of what the dress was in the way that all the hidden structure was part of what any well-made thing was. She thought about this because it felt true in a larger sense than just the dress. The years in the small room were inside her now the same way, invisible but structural, giving her the quality of knowing exactly what she could do with very little because she had done it, giving her the specific patience of someone who had waited for the right conditions because she understood that waiting served the outcome better than acting before the conditions were right. None of this would show from the outside. People who met her now would not see the small room or the narrow bed or the candle burning down while her hands worked in the night. But it was there. It was inside everything she was going to do from here. The carriage turned onto the long gravel drive. The sound changed under the wheels. The old oak trees closed their canopy overhead, bare now in winter, letting the white sky through in pieces between the branches. The estate came into view around the long curve, the pale stone of it unchanged by the season, the windows reflecting the white sky back at her. She looked at it with her father's habit of looking, which was directly and with the full attention the thing deserved. It was a house that had been built by people who intended to live in it, and she was going to live in it, and the north room was waiting with its north light, and there was a table being made to the right height, and the conversation that had begun in a gallery in front of a painting about a shadow with no blue in, it was going to continue in every room of this place for as long as they were both in it, which she intended to be a very long time. The carriage stopped at the entrance. The footman opened the door. She stepped out onto the gravel and the cold air met her and she breathed it in, the clean dry cold of late winter just before the turn, and she looked at the house, and she thought that her mother would have burned something on the first morning in the kitchen and sung while she was doing it, and her father would have found the room with the best afternoon light and stood at its window until he understood what was good about it. She was going to find the north room and stand in it and feel the quality of the light and understand what she could make in it. She reached back into the carriage for the box of materials. She carried it through the front door herself. She was not waiting for anyone to carry it for her. She had never been waiting for that. What she had been waiting for was the right conditions, and the conditions were right, and she had arrived and the work could begin. The door closed behind her. Outside, the winter morning continued doing what winter mornings did, cold and white and steady, indifferent to the things that happened inside the houses of the people in it. The gravel drive lay empty and the old oaks stood in their winter patience, and the sky was the pale sky of a day that was neither one thing nor the other, holding itself in the particular suspension of a season that was finishing. Inside, somewhere in the north wing with the windows that faced the correct direction, a room was waiting with its consistent and honest light. And Alara Voss, who was George Voss's daughter and Clara Voss's daughter, who had paid attention and been patient and known what to do with her hands when almost nothing was given to her, was going to find it. And begin.